Greetings, my dear friends. Today, we will delve into one of the most audacious and intriguing riddles of human history. What if the bloodline survived? This question doesn't declare itself with a thunderous roar. Rather, it whispers, seeping into the most hidden corners of consciousness, long after the day's hustle has quieted. What if Jesus of Nazareth, the figure behind the greatest myth, left behind not only teachings, but also descendants, a lineage of blood? Let this thought settle like dust in an ancient chapel, not shouting sacrilege, but humming with quiet defiance. For as we know, history is written by the victors, those who possess the power and strength to assert their version of events. But what happens to the stories of those who chose to remain in the shadows, guarding their secrets through the ages, far from the all-seeing eye of official historiography? These untold stories may conceal the deepest truths. Some traditionally minded scholars will undoubtedly point to the lack of direct evidence. They will recall doctrines, dogmas, and the decisions of church councils, such as the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, or the Council of Constantinople in 325 AD, 381 AD, which defined the canon of Holy Scripture, deciding which scrolls should be included in the sacred book, and which, like the texts found in Nag Hammadi in 1945, were best left buried in the sands of history. However, marginal historians, those irreverent whispers in academic echo chambers, have long traced a speculative thread. What if Mary Magdalene was not merely a devoted disciple, but also the mother of a secret bloodline, a genealogical tree that did not end at Golgotha, but quietly, strategically continued, guarded and protected under the veil of time? Imagine a small boat gently rocking off the shores of ancient Gaul. In it, Mary Magdalene, burdened by unbearable grief, possibly already pregnant, seeks refuge from the chaos and persecution that gripped Jerusalem after the tragic events. The air around is filled with the scent of sea salt and wild Provençal herbs. Somewhere in the distance, in the imagination, the faint chime of a church bell is heard, a church that did not yet exist in those distant times. It is here, in the south of France, in Provence, that legends begin to emerge, where locals still pass down stories in hushed tones about a holy woman who arrived from the east, carrying a treasure far more valuable than any gold or jewels, a living legacy. Traditional historians, of course, will greet these tales with overt skepticism, perhaps even rolling their eyes. They will say it is merely folklore, a fanciful blend of medieval piety, local vanity, and a dash of romance warmed by local wine. Yet despite their condescending laughter, even they must admit that these legends have persisted for over 1,000 years. This is an incredibly long time for any story to resist the historical shears that mercilessly cut away anything that doesn't fit the official narrative. Thus, we stand on the edge of a myth that refuses to die, continuing to stir minds to this very day. If you are interested in such historical mysteries, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like this video. It is very important for its promotion and for more people to learn about these amazing facts. Also, write in the comments where you are watching this video from, and please watch it to the end, as the most important conclusions will be made in the final part. Links to new videos can always be found in the description. The Templars, those enigmatic night monks, will appear in this story much later, bringing with them new layers of mystery. mysterious chapels, strange frescoes depicting women embracing not infants, but something far more intimate. All these elements will also reveal themselves in due course. But today, it all begins with a fundamental question, with the very breath of this hypothesis. What if the bloodline survived? The most powerful secrets, as we know, do not require loud declarations. They live in subtle gestures, in half-finished symbols, in barely discernible patterns on stone that reveal themselves only when the light falls at the right angle. Recall, for instance, the labyrinth tiles underfoot in Chartres Cathedral, where, it is said, initiates once made a silent journey to enlightenment. But we will return to labyrinths later. For now, let us imagine this bloodline, passed down not on banners of conquest or through grand pronouncements, but in cradles, hidden within monastery walls, transmitted through generations of merchant families, noble houses, and sometimes, when history grew too loud and dangerous, even among the simplest peasants, who guarded it as the apple of their eye. The essence was not power, at least not at first. The main goal was survival, because the very existence of this bloodline would mean persecution. Popes, wielding unlimited power, would not tolerate rival claims to divine right that could undermine their authority. Kings, striving for stability and predictability, would not tolerate unpredictable heirs capable of disrupting the existing order. And yet, across oceans of time, this whisper persisted, passed down from generation to generation, maintaining its vitality. Imagine it as a relay race, where instead of a traditional baton, a priceless secret is passed, fragile, utterly silent, yet capable of changing the world. And somewhere in the heart of Europe, in the Dark Ages, this secret is about to find its protectors, who wield swords not only for the liberation of Jerusalem, but for something far more ancient, far quieter, and deeply rooted in history. But to the Templars, as promised, we will return very soon to uncover their role in this captivating saga. The night air is full of questions, isn't it? It smells faintly of beeswax and ink, the kind scribes used in scriptoria by candlelight, copying ancient texts they perhaps weren't meant to read. You can almost hear the scratching of quills, the soft rustle of parchment as a monk pauses for a moment to glance over his shoulder, as if sensing an unseen presence. Remember this feeling. We will return to it when we enter Rennes-le-Château, a place shrouded in even more unsolved mysteries. For now, let our imaginations run wild. Imagine this bloodline passed down not with trumpets and fanfare, but with lullabies, softly whispered over a child's cradle. This bloodline survives precisely because it never sought a throne, never claimed rights to power. It hides in plain sight, among simple stonemasons, skilled apothecaries, and when the time comes, among the very warrior monks who kneel beneath red crosses, symbolizing their secret oath. Some historians will argue, asking a reasonable question, what is the point of a bloodline if it never claimed power, never manifested itself in history? But therein lies the irony, doesn't it? Perhaps the true strength lay precisely in this non-claim, in this quiet defiance that can outlast empires and civilizations. And now, as eyes close, the boat gently rocks again on that Provençal shore. The child is safe for now, but history has a habit of awakening sleeping secrets. Now you can continue your own journey into this quiet yet profound question. The waves have calmed, but the air is still filled with the scent of salt and an unsolved mystery. Let us imagine Mary Magdalene once more, her sandals touching the rocky Provençal shore, where the scent of rosemary clings to the morning mist. She appears not as an idealized saint from a stained glass window, but as a woman, weary yet determined, and just possibly pregnant. Legend, that stubborn old mule, persistently tells us that Mary Magdalene fled Jerusalem after the crucifixion, carrying with her not only inconsolable grief, but also a secret that could overthrow empires and rewrite all known history. There is a tradition that tells of Mary Magdalene's arrival on the shores of Sainte Marie de la Mer. In this version, she is met not by triumphant trumpets or jubilant crowds, but by a quiet, almost intuitive understanding from local fishermen and salt workers, people accustomed to the harsh secrets of the sea and land. In this sacred place, she is no longer merely the penitent sinner, an image shaped by ecclesiastical tradition for centuries. Here, in the south of France, her role transforms, elevating her to an entirely different status. She becomes the progenitor of entire dynasties. Of course, representatives of academic historical science typically greet such narratives with a good deal of skepticism. They immediately pull out their weighty parchments of refutation, insisting on the absence of convincing evidence and categorically declaring, "This is nothing more than medieval fabrications, an artful verbal embroidery." However, adherents of alternative views argue that not all evidence must necessarily be carved in stone or recorded in official chronicles. Sometimes truth breathes in invisible interstices, in those stories that grandmothers whisper to grandchildren from generation to generation, when the Provençal wind howls outside the tightly closed shutters of old houses. And it is these quiet whispers that tell of a sacred womb. According to this theory, Mary Magdalene, perhaps already carrying Jesus' child, was secretly taken from the chaotic region on a small boat, accompanied by a few loyal companions. Among them are named Joseph of Arimathea, and probably a chest containing not jewels or gold, but priceless scrolls, records of an ancient bloodline. This was a family tree whose roots were destined to intertwine deeply with European soil. One can almost vividly imagine her, wrapped in coarse indigo wool. She presses both her belly and this fragile future to herself. The boat rocks steadily on the waves. The sea quietly hisses at the sides. But her gaze remains fixed and focused, for she clearly understands that true survival does not depend on banners and armies. It is contained in children, in secrets safely kept until the opportune moment. The narrative, winding through the hills of Provence, unexpectedly encounters something highly unusual and mysterious, the phenomenon of the Black Madonna. In numerous sanctuaries of this region, statues of a dark-skinned virgin begin to appear, looking mysterious and seemingly out of place in a traditional Christian context. Some researchers and adherents of alternative hypotheses see in them the image of Mary Magdalene, presented in a special light, while others suggest a connection with the ancient Egyptian goddess Isis, as if reborn in a new guise. The official church, in response to such interpretations, usually just politely coughs and tries to steer the conversation in a completely different direction, avoiding direct comments. However, these statues do not disappear or fade away. They continue to stand, immutable and eternal, silently but eloquently testifying to the existence of a bloodline, hidden in plain sight. Naturally, scholars still hotly debate the origin and true meaning of the Black Madonna. Was she merely a cultural quirk? A reflection of a medieval fascination with exotic pigments? Or, as some marginal theorists suggest, do these statues represent a veiled, allegorical tribute to a maternal bloodline that the Church dared not speak of openly? A traveler passing through the stone villages of Provence feels time flow slowly here, as if frozen for centuries. Here, ancient frescoes slowly crack under the impact of time, but their profound meaning remains unchanged. In one such old chapel, one might discover a fresco depicting a woman washing a man's feet. Notably, this act is presented not with a halo of holiness or mystical radiance, but with such an ordinary, almost domestic familiarity that it causes noticeable bewilderment among theologians. The question arises, perhaps she is his wife, or is art simply playing cruel tricks on the observer, offering ambiguous interpretations? Esoteric historians, these curious and often eccentric researchers, meticulously trace such clues like breadcrumbs left on a path. For them, Mary Magdalene ceases to be merely a repentant follower or disciple. She appears as a sacred vessel, the living embodiment of the Grail, carrier of a precious bloodline destined to intertwine with Europe's most ancient and powerful royal houses. It is at this point that the narrative begins to take on even more convoluted and intriguing contours. The Merovingians enter the scene. The Merovingians were Frankish kings who entered history thanks to their distinctive features, long, uncut hair, which symbolized their sacred connection to the divine, as well as the use of snake symbols, referring to ancient cults, and perhaps the most annoying habit, being unlike all other rulers of their time. The official church, as is known, tolerated their presence only with great difficulty and obvious reluctance. However, alternative theories suggest that these monarchs were not just ambitious warlords seeking to expand their domains. According to these hypotheses, the Merovingians were guardians of a sacred bloodline, a kind of protectors of Mary Magdalene's descendants. Their mission was to ensure that this unique line would never be broken, that it could not be destroyed by enemy swords, papal decrees, or the all-consuming flow of time. But a more detailed examination of Merovingian history will be undertaken later. For now, imagine a quiet, almost invisible conspiracy woven from generations of mothers and daughters. These women passed on to each other not only family recipes and customs, but also deep secrets of the bloodline, sacred lullabies in which pulsed the rhythm of a forgotten dynasty. While kings waged bloody wars and struggled for power, these guardians carefully nurtured the true legacy in cozy, candlelit kitchens and sun-drenched vineyards of Provence. One can almost hear the creak of old wooden floors in an ancient Provençal farmhouse. The thick, intoxicating scent of lavender hangs in the air as an old matron, bending over a child, quietly whispers, "You carry something very ancient within you, my child. Something they would silence if they only could. This is a bloodline that never sought thrones or earthly power, but its very existence has always been enough of a threat to those who feared the truth." Historians will, no doubt, endlessly debate these assumptions. Some of them persistently argue that it is nothing more than romantic nonsense, a patchwork quilt sewn from folk tales and conjectures by conspiracy hunters with too much free time and too little evidence. However, paradoxically, these same historians are still unable to fully explain the persistent and profound veneration of Mary Magdalene in this particular region, and why her unseen presence seems so firmly woven into the very fabric of the Provençal land, into its ancient stones, Ultimately, symbols and traditions often withstand the test of time where dry facts crumble under its onslaught. And when a researcher today traces her shadow through the cobbled alleys of old towns, he is not pursuing a canonized saint. He is following a woman who managed to survive entire empires, relying not on armies and power, but on quiet whispers, on secrets passed down by word of mouth. If this bloodline truly survived, it did not declare itself with loud shouts or manifestos. It sang quietly, like an ancient ballad, patiently awaiting those ears that would finally be able to hear its melody. One can feel it now, this barely perceptible, quiet pull of a bloodline that pierces through the depths of time like an invisible thread, weaving everyone willing to listen into its ancient mystery. From the sun-drenched Provençal shores, the narrative's path now leads to a dynasty shrouded in a thick veil of mystery and marked by enigmatic serpent signs, to the Merovingians. One can imagine them not as faceless monarchs from dusty history books, but as living, breathing enigmas whose presence is felt across centuries. One might envision a solemn coronation taking place in a basilica lit by hundreds of candles, where Frankish nobles kneel, their swords gleaming beneath majestic vaulted arches. At the very center of this ceremony stands the Merovingian king, his hair uncut, cascading like a river of shadows over his shoulders, a symbol of his ancient power and sacred origin. This long hair, as legends tell, was not merely a fashion statement or external attribute for the Merovingians. It was a sacred symbol, a kind of pledge and covenant, emphasizing their special status. The longer the king's hair, the purer and more ancient his bloodline was considered. Historians remind us that the Merovingians ruled the Franks for a significant period, from the 5th to the 8th centuries AD. Their historical legacy is a complex tangle of numerous battles, palace intrigues, betrayals, and constantly shifting, blurred borders. Academic researchers meticulously explain how their power gradually weakened, eventually being seized by the more politically astute and ambitious Carolingians, marking the end of one of the most enigmatic dynasties in European history. However, there is something that remains beyond their explanations, something they cannot grasp: the persistent symbolism of the serpent, which, like a coiled guardian, entwines this dynasty. Some marginal theorists argue that these monarchs were not merely warlords or rulers in the usual sense. They appear as guardians, zealous protectors of an ancient bloodline. Their very reign, according to this version, served as a reliable shield for something far more archaic than an ordinary monarchy, something sacred and perhaps deeply inconvenient for accepted notions. The motif of serpentine grace can be traced on many Merovingian artifacts. It twists, engraved on bronze buckles, intricately interwoven in stained glass patterns, encircling royal seals. For some researchers, this was nothing more than a pagan remnant, an ancient symbol of wisdom and knowledge. For others, it held a veiled reference to a bloodline whose roots, it is supposed, went back to the exiled womb of Magdalene. Of course, academic scholars greet such interpretations with a skeptical smirk. They rightly point out that images of snakes were very common in Gallo-Roman art, and, in their opinion, to connect them with mystical, sacred bloodlines is to stretch facts, creating contrived connections. But perhaps their true concern is not the serpent itself. They are troubled by the thought that beneath the seemingly unshakable surface of medieval Christianity, An ancient, unbroken thread of heritage stubbornly refused to be severed, continuing to exist against all odds. Imagine a person stopping in the courtyard of an ancient abbey. Gravel crunches melodically under his boots, each step echoing. At this moment, a Merovingian queen floats past him like a vision, her cloak of deep indigo and crimson velvet whispering of the cold stone she treads. In her hands rests a bronze pendant in the shape of an 8-pointed star, perhaps a simple family heirloom, or perhaps a key to a much deeper secret. The church, ever vigilant and zealously monitoring order, felt palpable discomfort regarding these long-haired kings. Their stubborn refusal to cut their hair was not a simple display of vanity or fashion. It was an act of defiant disobedience, a quiet but persistent claim to a legacy that no bishop had the power to excommunicate or anathematize. And when subtle persuasion and gentle admonitions proved powerless, history, like a ruthless tailor, sharpened its scissors. The Carolingians rose to the political arena, and the Merovingians officially disappeared from the historical stage. However, history, as is known, handles unfinished business very poorly, leaving many questions in its wake. The persistent theory claims that, although the dynasty was politically dismantled, its bloodline simply went underground, dissolving and being absorbed by noble houses, scattered among merchant families, hiding under new coats of arms, but always remaining vigilant and ready for revival. And somewhere on this secret path, the enigmatic Knights Templar, these guardians in white cloaks, took on the mantle of protecting this heritage. Now let's recall the Black Madonna, which can be found in Provençal chapels. Her images begin to appear more and more often in Poland, in Catalonia, even in remote Alpine churches. She is always dark-skinned, always appears in a maternal image, and is often shrouded in a thick veil of mystery. Was she a symbol of inclusivity, uniting different cultures? Or did she serve as a cipher for those who knew exactly where to look to unravel the hidden meaning? Closing one's eyes, one can try to imagine this picture. Imagine a Templar chapel high in the hills. The air is cold and thick with the scent of frankincense. Beneath a fresco depicting a veiled Madonna, a knight kneels, slowly tracing a serpent carved into the stone floor. He is not praying for victory in battle or for earthly blessings. His prayer and his actions are directed at keeping a name, a bloodline in memory, so that they are not forgotten. Some scholars still reject these ideas. All coincidence, they murmur, dismissive of such theories. Just folk tradition, they add. But how many coincidences must layer upon each other before disparate elements form an undeniable pattern? One begins to see it, doesn't one? The Merovingians were never just another dynasty. They were a living cipher, a complex enigma. And though their crowns were taken, their secret lived on in ancient manuscripts, in intricate carvings, in the veiled rituals of the few who understood the true stakes and significance of this heritage. This bloodline was never loud. It never announced itself publicly. But its presence is felt with the same stubborn persistence as the scent of wax and myrrh that lingers long in old stone chapels after the candles have been extinguished. As evening gloom gathers and the serpents coil back into the shadows, one realizes the Merovingians never truly vanished. They simply changed how they existed and moved. And beneath the Templar cross, their bloodline patiently awaited its next guardians. The torchlight flickers on the stone as we descend deeper, deeper into the silence, deeper into the pulse beating beneath the thin skin of history. One no longer stands in a magnificent cathedral, towering above the earth. One is beneath it, where the air is colder and thicker. The crypt of Rennes-le-Château awaits its explorer. Rennes-le-Château is a name that itself buzzes with the anticipation of mischief and mystery. For some, it is merely a quaint village nestled on a hill in the south of France. For others, it is a true vortex of enigmas, a place where, it is rumored, ancient parchments and whispering bloodlines are hidden. But today, it is more a labyrinth of shadows, where secrets were once safely tucked away in dry ossuaries and beneath weathered altars. Officially, it's just another unremarkable country church. Unofficially, well, this place has been accused of hiding everything from Templar treasures to the supposed bones of Christ himself. Scholars, of course, will wag their fingers and sigh, calling such stories unfounded theories and sensational nonsense. And yet, these same scholars still visit the place quietly, discreetly, as if they, too, sense that the stones here remember far more than they are willing to show at first glance. One passes under a Romanesque arch, where a Latin inscription twists in time-worn letters. This place inspires awe, but not in the sense of being ugly or repulsive, but in the ancient, archaic meaning of the word. Awesome in the sense of both inspiring reverence and being sacred and potentially dangerous. It is here that our story gains a new guardian. Béranger Saunière, a 19th-century parish priest who, according to legend, stumbled upon mysterious parchments during the church's restoration. These parchments, it is claimed, hinted at a secret so vast that it could either ransom kings from any trouble or forever bury their reputation and power. Some claim Saunière discovered genealogical records, scrolls of a bloodline tracing not only known noble families, but also the most noble family, one of particular significance. Others suggest they were merely coded Templar documents containing their secrets. And of course, there are those who persistently argue that he found nothing at all, but was simply a priest with an extraordinary talent for fundraising and church interior design. However, if one looks closely, the reconstructions carried out by Abbot Saunière were highly peculiar. For example, the demonic Asmodeus supported the holy water font there, and the altar was guarded by statues of Mary Magdalene. The frescoes depicted little-known biblical scenes, presented so strangely and provocatively that it was as if the church walls themselves winked at the viewer, silently whispering, "Not everything sacred necessarily wears a halo." One can imagine Saunière, kerosene lamp in hand, descending a narrow staircase leading beneath the altar. His boots echoed hollowly against the damp stone until he discovered and retrieved a small wooden casket, sealed with a wax emblem, a serpent entwined around a star. He was not a mere treasure hunter, rather, he was a guardian, a man deeply aware that truly priceless artifacts are sometimes not meant for public display in daylight. There are various versions regarding the contents of this mysterious find. Some claim Saunière discovered a document irrefutably proving the survival of a royal bloodline originating from Jesus and Mary Magdalene. Other sources suggest it was a map pointing to hidden Templar treasures, and still others quietly whisper that it was an ancient book containing the names of the guardians, protectors, and bearers of this very bloodline, which had managed to survive the harsh trials of inquisitions and church excommunications. It is here that the key contradiction lies. causing many historians to shrug in bewilderment. Saunière suddenly acquired a significant fortune, and his wealth was completely inexplicable. This was not like a modest win in a village lottery. His funds allowed for lavish church restorations and the acquisition of extensive private libraries. The question arises, was this a mere coincidence, or was he paid enormous hush money for keeping a secret so explosive that its revelation could have catastrophic consequences? One can imagine the creak of old iron hinges as a massive stone slab slides aside. Beneath it, a hidden cavity is revealed, covered in centuries of dust and strewn with ancient bones. And at its very center, carefully wrapped in oil-soaked cloth, lies a scroll, not a familiar gospel, but a detailed genealogical table. The names on it branched out like grapevines, tracing connections across many centuries, forming a family tree that, by all canons, should not have existed. Certainly, skeptical minds resolutely dismiss such claims. They insist that Saunière's prosperity was the result of trafficking masses, and the entire treasure story is merely a myth, cleverly fabricated by greedy opportunists. However, if that were the case, what would be the point of the enigmatic inscriptions? Why would hidden chambers be necessary? Why would such an ingenious reinterpretation and reconstruction of sacred icons into complex patterns, which for the discerning observer tell of events far beyond accepted dogma, be required? It seemed that the village itself was a palimpsest, an ancient parchment on which text had been rewritten but not completely erased, leaving traces of earlier writings beneath the new layer. As one leaves the crypt, the night air feels different. It seems lighter, yet palpably electrified. One's gaze involuntarily falls on the chapel's facade, where the twin columns of Jachin and Boaz rise. They appear as silent guardians, their presence interpreted either as Masonic symbols or perhaps as references to much older and deeper traditions of guardianship. The visitor finds themselves in a place where symbols gain far greater expressiveness than church sermons, and images of snakes and stars engage in a silent dialogue, drowning out the ringing of bells. The bloodline here is not just an ancient relic. It is alive. It seems to breathe through the stone mortar, through the sacred geometry that Saunière skillfully incorporated into his church's architecture, cleverly disguised as ordinary decorative elements. And regardless of whether one believes in the existence of ancient parchments, the spirit of Rennes-le-Château invariably prompts one to ask, what secret was so dangerous and powerful that it had to be carefully concealed under layers of myths, stonework, and deliberate misinformation? As moonlight bathes the village, one can feel this mysterious pulse of the bloodline, which, it seems, never truly faded. One now finds oneself beneath the overhanging arches of an ancient Templar commandery. The air here is still, yet palpably electrified, as if the ancient stones themselves are attentively listening to the world around them. This is the place where quiet whispers transform into unbreakable vows. Here, legends were born not in opulent royal halls, but in cold, vaulted chambers, where secrecy was the first and last rule of existence for the Knights Templar. According to accepted historical doctrine, they were crusaders, warrior monks equally skilled with both sword and holy scripture. However, beneath this impeccably polished official narrative lies another, far deeper layer that stubbornly resists being erased by the passage of time. What if their crusades pursued goals significantly exceeding the simple desire to liberate Jerusalem? What if their true mission was to preserve not sacred relics, but an ancient bloodline? A bloodline whose revelation could undermine and destroy the very foundation of the Christian hierarchy. The Church officially branded them heretics, and royal power declared them a threat to state order. However, those who operated in the shadows possessed a deeper understanding of the true state of affairs. The Templars were not just knights. They were guardians of a secret that was not only significantly older than any papal decree, but also incomparably more dangerous. One can imagine a secret council gathered deep within a Templar preceptory. The room was circular, and the massive table was adorned with an 8-pointed star, the very symbol previously seen in the intricate labyrinths of chapels, engraved on hidden vault doors, and etched onto bronze pendants passed down through generations. Torches cast flickering reflections on the knights' faces. Their gazes were solemn as they exchanged vows in hushed tones. At the center of the table lay a single scroll, sealed with a crimson wax serpent. This was not a plan for an upcoming battle. It was a genealogical table, a detailed map of bloodlines whose roots traced back to a highly controversial and unorthodox source. At this point, mainstream historians inevitably interject. They insist that the Templars were primarily bankers, soldiers, and builders, not guardians of ancient bloodlines. However, it is precisely here that the logic of the traditional narrative falters. How did a military order manage to accumulate such sudden and colossal wealth? How did they gain access to the closed archives of the Vatican, secure privileges no other order dared claim, and erect fortified structures containing enigmatic architectural codes? Marginal theorists, in turn, put forth the hypothesis that beneath their warlike exterior, the Templars effectively operated as a widespread and mobile network of guardians. The treasures they were accused of unlawfully appropriating were not golden chalices or jewel-encrusted relics. They were documents, genealogical data, keys to a bloodline that, if confirmed, was capable of destabilizing both royal thrones and ecclesiastical altars. As an example, one can cite the persistent legends of Templar ships, laden not with military spoils, but with chests full of sealed scrolls and carved stone tablets. These vessels were headed not for trade markets, but for secure and safe harbors where the bloodline could quietly and unbrokenly continue its existence. One can almost visualize this scene in the dead of night, under the cloak of secrecy. A Templar ship glides silently. Its sides seem burdened not so much by cargo as by the significance of its sacred mission. The vessel moves away from the vigilant eye of the Inquisition, heading towards secluded abbeys, where the monastic inhabitants, it is believed, understood the true stakes of what was happening. Certainly, the academic community tends to caution against hasty conclusions, reminding us that correlation is by no means causality, and the Templars' actions could have been dictated purely by pragmatic considerations. However, when a careful researcher begins to identify patterns in the placement of Templar commanderies, strategically built along ancient pilgrimage routes that, as if by an amazing coincidence, align with the presumed migration paths of certain bloodlines, it becomes increasingly difficult to ignore this complex, yet intriguing interconnectedness. Within the walls of these commanderies, far from prying eyes, rituals were performed that are not mentioned in any chronicle or book. The initiation of the protectors of the mysterious bloodline did not occur through lavish and solemn ceremonies, but through barely audible whispered oaths, uttered beneath ancient arches, illuminated by flickering candlelight. Here symbols, images of serpents, shining stars, intricate labyrinths, served as the true language of these gatherings, remaining completely invisible and incomprehensible to those who sought only the clanging of swords and the jingle of coins within the order. There is an ancient Templar saying, now rarely remembered, "Not all treasure is silver." In the context of these hidden practices, it takes on the deepest meaning, imbued with a weight incomparable to any earthly treasuries. Let us transport ourselves mentally to that very council chamber, where an atmosphere of tense anticipation reigned. The Grand Master, clad in modest attire, his eyes full of discernment, carefully unseals an ancient scroll, using a blade skillfully forged in the shape of a serpent's fang. He begins to read aloud, and it becomes clear this is not a royal decree or an ecclesiastical bull, but simply a name. The name of a child born in deep secrecy, a bearer of that very bloodline whose existence the vast majority of the world would vehemently deny. This name, once spoken in this sacred circle, is immediately transformed into an unbreakable oath of protection, forever woven into the sacred vows of every knight present at this fateful gathering. The hostile attitude of ecclesiastical authorities towards the Templar order in that era was not merely limited to a banal fear of a potential rival for power. Rather, it seemed a preemptive and decisive strike aimed at those who were the guardians and bearers of a particular narrative, a tale capable of radically rewriting the very theological foundations of the Christian world. Notably, this narrative was embodied not in abstract doctrines or sacred texts, but in living flesh and blood. When King Philip IV of France organized mass arrests of the order's knights in 1307, the official accusations, heresy, idolatry, blasphemy, served only as a convenient veil. However, beneath this veil lay the true, unforgivable crime: possession. Possession of profound truths that could not be silenced or refuted by any papal bulls or church decrees. A number of historians lean towards the version that the suppression of the powerful Templar order was due solely to economic and political motives. Their untold riches seemed too tempting, and their influence too extensive. However, such an explanation seems extremely incomplete. If the true goal was merely to seize material assets, why then such a fanatical obsession with eradicating every tiny trace of their rituals, their unique symbols, and all their scrolls? Monarchs, as is known, are capable of forgiving greed. They are even willing to tolerate excessive power. But a secret capable of calling into question the very legitimacy of their divine right to the throne simply could not be left alive. Consequently, the greatest treasure of the Templars was by no means a gilded chalice, safely hidden in some secret compartment. It was merely a genealogical table, a modest, at first glance, fragile document, but possessing enough power to destroy centuries of established dogma overnight. A document that silently, yet powerfully proclaimed, "The bloodline continues, quietly, relentlessly." As the last torch slowly flickers out in the dimly lit stone chamber, and the knights rise to disperse, it becomes evident this was no ordinary meeting. This was a solemn affirmation, a covenant renewed, binding them to something far greater. And somewhere, carefully hidden beneath layers of ancient architecture and complex history. This mysterious bloodline continues its existence, guarded by the undying echo of those whispered vows. Meanwhile, under the cover of the moonlit sky, the sea breathes silently, as a lone ship confidently cuts through the dark waters. Now, the imagined observer might feel themselves standing on the deck of this vessel, where the sea wind whips their cloak and salty spray settles on their lips. This voyage is by no means an ordinary journey. This ship does not seek military glory or territorial conquests. Its path leads to silence and oblivion. On the very night the Order's disappearance was officially recorded, the Templar fleet also vanished without a trace. A fleet whispered about only in port taverns, and whose existence royal scribes refused to believe. Official chronicles detail arrests and forced confessions, confiscated assets, and the punishment of heretics. However, a legitimate question arises. What happened to those ships that managed to slip out of La Rochelle before royal envoys could tighten their net? Some marginal historians put forth an intriguing hypothesis. The Templars were fleeing not only with gold, they were carrying away vital documents, precious relics, and something incomparably more valuable, a living bloodline. Now perhaps a certain sacred burden is felt. It is the weight of a small wooden chest, securely tied under a tarpaulin and sealed with a wax emblem of a serpent. By itself, it is small and unadorned. However, its contents, it is presumed, could have shaken and destroyed entire dynasties. Nevertheless, representatives of mainstream historiography will certainly claim that all this is nothing more than convenient myth-making. There is no documentary evidence of a lost Templar fleet, they insist, their fingers confidently tracing the clear lines of maps that it seems fundamentally refuse to acknowledge the existence of shadows and inexplicable gaps. Nevertheless, highly suspicious gaps are found in the port logs of La Rochelle. Entire days remain unrecorded, and numerous ships unaccounted for. What if this sea voyage was the true exodus, not a migration of people, but the flight of a carefully guarded secret? On the ship's deck, surrounded by the night gloom, hooded figures stand guard. Their hands rest not on sword hilts, but on scrolls and sealed chests. They are not merely warriors, but guardians, couriers of that very bloodline that would find no place in royal courts or within the walls of official churches. Every gust of wind sweeping across the deck is perceived by them as a countdown. Every creak of wood in the night silence serves as a reminder that an unbearable weight of forbidden blood rests on their shoulders. Deep in the hold, below deck, a veiled woman gently cradles a small child. Her fingers carefully glide over a bronze pendant resting on the infant's neck, an image of an 8-pointed star entwined with a serpent. This is not a simple ornament, but a deeply symbolic artifact, embodying an ancient heritage and the immense responsibility placed upon this child. This child is not destined to ascend a throne or to rule earthly kingdoms. Its future is destined to be much quieter, yet incomparably more dangerous. It is the next, vitally important link in this ancient and mysterious bloodline. It is in this aspect that the official history of the Church begins to seem particularly shaky and incomplete. Why was the persecution of the Templars so sudden and so absolute, leaving no room for compromise? Why was such unprecedented haste necessary, if not out of the fear that gripped ecclesiastical and royal circles that something irreversible and fundamental was about to slip away, hiding beneath the ocean waves, forever disappearing from their reach. Marginal historians invariably emphasize the inexplicable calm that descended around La Rochelle after the tragic October 13th, 1707. Witnesses to those events seemed to suddenly suffer from amnesia, and official reports lost all clarity, becoming remarkably vague. It felt as if an invisible hand had reached into ancient annals and deliberately distorted the ink, erasing inconvenient facts. At this moment, as the vessel sways on the waves, a small, barely visible island appears on the horizon. This place, unmarked on any royal map, may be a long-forgotten monastery, or merely a random waypoint in the endless sea. However, its true significance lies in its being an isolated and inaccessible refuge, an ideal sanctuary for sacred secrets that should never be officially revealed. The Templars, contrary to popular belief, did not seek mighty fortresses with impregnable walls. Their true need was for secluded nooks where truth could paradoxically hide in plain sight. A simple stone chapel, a walled garden, or a labyrinth intricately carved into rock. These places became their sacred repositories. Thus, the continuous line of descendants and knowledge was preserved, not in lavish palaces where luxury reigns, but in humble, secluded monasteries, under the vigilant care of those who fully understood the grandeur and responsibility of their mission. As the observer descends into the hold, the air becomes heavy and saturated with the scents of wax and old parchment. Scrolls, carefully wrapped in oil-soaked leather, are neatly stacked like fragile logs. However, it is the ancient genealogical table that draws their gaze. Spread out on an improvised altar, it stretches through the ages. Its ink has faded with time, but it retains a surprising resilience. Inscribed here are names that could have no place in official chronicles and public writings, names that, if dared to be uttered in certain courts, would immediately provoke the wrath of the Inquisition and cruel persecution. The Templars were not fleeing simple punishment for imagined crimes. Their flight was dictated by a desire to avoid the complete eradication of their order and heritage. Above, in the darkness of the night, it seems that the very elements whisper of possible pursuit. Perhaps it is merely the restless breath of the boundless sea playing with one's hearing. Or perhaps it is the ghostly echo of royal ships creeping in the darkness, driven by a monarch's orders to obtain not precious gold, but something incomparably more threatening to the established order of things, a living, breathing truth. Of course, skeptics will undoubtedly raise their eyebrows at such reasoning. They will insist on the absence of tangible evidence, pointing to the alarming allure of conspiracy theories. However, in every rejected legend lies an unyielding seed of truth that relentlessly resists the erosion of time. It is an elusive fragment that will not disappear without a trace, no matter how carefully one tries to erase it from the annals. This feeling now hangs in the air, the tension, the pervasive weight of centuries, inexorably pressing down on the ship's fragile wooden hull. For this ship carries not only people or valuable artifacts, it carries an embodied contradiction, a living paradox, boldly challenging the orderliness of official history. As the island draws near, the torchlight begins to tremble along its stark, rocky shore. Silent, hooded figures await the arrival. Their hands are empty, yet seem heavy with unspoken anticipation. Tonight, the bloodline will silently pass from one generation of guardians to the next. No grand fanfares, no recorded ceremonies, just the silent transfer of a secret too dangerous to be entrusted to scrolls alone. The ship glides smoothly into a sheltered cove, where the sound of the surf is muffled by sharp rocks. Moorings are cast, heavy chests are brought ashore, carefully bound scrolls are carried off. Last to disembark is a child, hidden beneath the folds of a simple wool cloak. No banners, no trumpets announcing the event, and yet, history quietly takes its turn. As the ship vanishes into the mist, the observer realizes this was not a panicked flight. This was a migration of truth, a movement of that which refuses to be silenced. Even when this truth seemed buried beneath oceans of time, the observer finds themselves under the cold vault of a mountain abbey, where every breath feels like an intrusion. The air in the abbey is sharp, imbued with the scent of candle wax and something even more ancient, perhaps raw stone, or the faint trace of frankincense that hasn't been burned here for many centuries. Here, secrets seem to rest, or rather skillfully pretend to sleep. The abbey itself is practically indistinguishable on royal maps. Built in the heart of a granite peak, it is a true fortress, cleverly disguised as a humble place of prayer. However, the monks residing here are not ordinary brothers. Their vows extend far beyond traditional oaths of silence and poverty. They are guardians of an ancient heritage that does not fit into the canons of sacred psalms. Traditional historians are often inclined to dismiss such places as nothing more than monastic curiosities or remnants of feudal patronage. However, if certain patterns are carefully examined, it becomes clear that these remote monasteries are suspiciously clustered along long-forgotten pilgrimage routes, routes that, marginal theorists claim, served as secret arteries for the preservation of a bloodline, permeating throughout Europe and forming an invisible network of sanctuaries and safe havens. The observer walks down a narrow corridor, their fingers gliding over the rough walls that seem to breathe countless stories. At the end of the corridor is a room, modest and almost bare, save for a single stone pedestal on which rests an ancient bronze reliquary. The motif of a serpent entwined around a star faintly glimmers in the dim light, symbolizing a quiet yet persistent defiance of centuries that sought to consign it to oblivion. Some authoritative scholars argue that this is where mythology goes too far. There is no credible evidence to link these rural abbeys to the Templar exodus, they insist, clinging tightly to their academic references and verified facts. But what if evidence does not always take the form of ink and parchment? What if the true testimony lies in the very architecture of these structures, in deliberate inconsistencies in layout, in enigmatic labyrinth engravings on floor tiles, or in chapel apses oriented not toward sacred Jerusalem, but toward little-known constellations? From the shadows emerges a monk, his hood pulled low over his face, his steps utterly silent. He carries an ancient scroll case made of old oak and tied with a crimson silk ribbon. He presents it not with ostentatious ceremony, but with quiet, almost weary reverence, as if this transfer has been invariably repeated from generation to generation, always with the same mute yet profound solemnity. The observer notices his fingers linger for a moment on the silk knot. This is not a sign of reluctance to part with a valuable item, but a deep understanding once this scroll leaves his hands, another link in this centuries-old chain of silence is released into the world beyond the abbey walls, vulnerable yet invincible. The scroll itself was not a majestic folio, striking in size. On the contrary, it was quite concise, yet its ancient ink contained challenges that transcended centuries. The recorded names were meticulously listed, consciously avoiding any titles, which emphasized their authenticity. Genealogies were recorded not to demonstrate pride or social status, but solely to ensure the continuity of generations. The moment came when one took this scroll into their hands, and its palpable weight seemed utterly disproportionate to its modest size. This strange feeling was akin to what an ancient scribe in Alexandria might have felt, silently watching the inexorable flames consume the great library. It was not so much about the loss of ordinary paper, but about the loss of the very breath of history, of irretrievably lost, unspoken narratives. Outside the monastery walls, the wind persistently howled, making its way through ancient arches. This sound was perceived as a sinister warning, foreshadowing something important. Some marginal theorists, whose views sometimes diverge from the mainstream, have suggested that the astonishing survival of this ancient bloodline was not the result of grand, large-scale conspiracies, but rather of countless small, yet deliberate and conscious acts of preservation. Examples of such acts could include a mother carefully passing a family pendant to her child, or a monk secretly hiding a precious scroll under an old floorboard, or even a knight who chose harsh exile rather than break an oath and confess. Within the abbey itself, where these events unfolded, each such choice made in the past resonated powerfully. There is a curious theory that certain monastic orders were never fully incorporated into the strict ecclesiastical hierarchy. They invariably remained on the periphery of the religious world, operating, one might say, on its outskirts, and it was there that they painstakingly preserved oral histories, sacred symbols, and ancient rituals that were considered too dangerous to be publicly written down. The monks inhabiting this place may utter familiar Latin prayers, but their true liturgy remains unwritten, passed down by word of mouth, skillfully veiled in complex ritual gestures and coded hymns. Of course, academic scholars would probably only scoff at such reasoning. Romantic nonsense, they would undoubtedly declare, pointing to the complete absence of any written doctrine. But perhaps that is the profound essence of it all. Some truths, by their very nature, are simply not meant to be recorded on paper with ink. The traveler finds himself in a small apothecary room, its shelves filled to the brim with glass vials and bundles of dried herbs, exuding a subtle aroma. At first, this room seems completely irrelevant, its purpose not immediately grasped. But then the gaze falls on a faint, barely discernible outline of a serpent, skillfully carved into the central beam of the apothecary. It is almost erased by the relentless passage of time, yet it remains unmistakably recognizable. It becomes clear that this room serves not only to heal the mortal body. The monk nearby silently gestures to an unusual map, made of goatskin and spread out on a simple wooden table. It lacks familiar borders. No kingdoms or geographical features are marked. Instead, it presents a complex grid of enigmatic symbols, 8-pointed stars, coiled serpents, chalices, labyrinths. This was clearly not a map of a place in the traditional sense. It was, rather, a map of memory, where each symbol denoted a specific location where the bloodline had been carefully preserved. Some of these places turned out to be abbeys, Others, mysterious caves, deep wells, and even, at first glance, completely ordinary crossroads. The traveler's finger slides over the mysterious symbols, and he feels an invisible but strong web spread across Europe, running through inaccessible mountain passes and hiding beneath centuries-old city stones. It becomes clear that the essence was not in some specific destination, but precisely in this comprehensive connection. The monk standing nearby remained silent, but the questioning look in his eyes and the unspoken expectation were palpable in the air. Would this person remember what ink dared not entrust to paper? In the distance, the abbey bells chimed, their sounds muffled by distance, yet their rhythmic peal resonated deeply in the soul. This place was not meant for loud declarations or grandiose speeches. It was a sanctuary of quiet but unwavering perseverance. Now it was clear that the Bloodline's astonishing resilience had little to do with lavish royal alliances or secret knight vows. It survived and continued its existence thanks to these long-forgotten, but so important sanctuaries, where history was preserved not in dusty archives, but in every breath, in living memory, in deep silence. As one returns to the corridor, the reliquary remains on its pedestal, surprisingly unguarded, yet absolutely inviolable, as if protected by an invisible force. Its presence in this place is perceived as a quiet, yet powerful rebellion against accepted norms. A constant reminder that by no means all true treasures are adorned with royal crowns or carefully kept under majestic cathedral domes. This bloodline does not hide in fear. On the contrary, it patiently awaits its hour. Following the monk, the traveler delves into a narrow passage where the walls seem to constrict, creating a sense of confinement. Stone seems to breathe against stone, and each step taken resonates in the mind with an exaggerated, almost mystical importance. The air around grows noticeably colder, wetter, and a slight, barely perceptible metallic taste appears. The traveler descends underground again, and by this point, they already know that it is in such hidden depths that true stories prefer to lurk. Beneath the abbey, a vault is indeed discovered, but it is by no means the grand, echoing treasury one might expect. On the contrary, this room is modest in size, has a low ceiling, and its walls are lined not with shining gold, but with rows of simple niches. In each such niche, a small, unremarkable chest, made of wood and banded with iron, is carefully preserved. Some of them barely exceed the size of an ordinary loaf of bread. There are no richly decorated carvings, no precious stone inlays, only simple, unpretentious vessels holding forgotten legacies. Some marginal historians, whose approaches to studying the past differ from the generally accepted ones, have given these repositories the name bone libraries. And this is not because they necessarily contain human remains, although, of course, who can say for sure, but because they contain the very quintessence of stories, the genetic code of entire dynasties. These humble chests do not hold treasures in the traditional royal sense of the word. Instead, they carefully preserve bloodline markers, serpent-shaped rings, skillfully engraved chalices, and fragments of ancient parchment on which family seals are clearly visible. However, mainstream historians, adhering to more conservative views, prefer a less poetic and drier name for them: monastic relic archives. For them, these are simply dry, sterile, purely academic objects of study. They meticulously catalog the contents, carefully mark their inventories with footnotes, and completely miss the most important point. For these are not merely museum exhibits meant for display. They are, rather, a kind of breadcrumbs pointing the way. The traveler pauses before one of the niches, where a chest is found slightly ajar, as if inviting one to look inside. The monk, noticing the guest's gaze, silently and with extreme caution, lifts the lid. Inside, on a neatly folded piece of goatskin, rests a small bronze pendant. On the surface of the pendant, an 8-pointed star is distinctly engraved, skillfully intertwined with a coiled serpent. This was an emblem that for centuries mysteriously appeared in the margins of little-known manuscripts, was subtly carved into the door frames of ancient chapels, and secretly worn by members of certain noble bloodlines. But it is here, at this point, that scholars engage in endless debates. Some researchers argue that the star serpent symbol represents a Templar reinterpretation of the ancient Eastern Ouroboros, citing historical trade routes and the widespread cultural dissemination of such images. Others stubbornly insist on its Merovingian origin, seeing in it a sign of sovereign blood that was appropriated and carefully concealed by the Templars after the tragic fall of Jerusalem. These debates seem almost as ancient as the old chest itself, around which they rage. You pick up a scroll made of goatskin. It gives off a faint crackle, its surface feeling dry and fibrous, like the ancient skin of some long-vanished creature. The ink on it has visibly faded, yet remains quite legible, and the script is neither Latin nor Greek. It is, without a doubt, a cipher, a language of glyphs, intended not for universal reading, but for memorization by only the chosen few. The monk lights a small oil lamp placed on a stone shelf. The soft light gently spreads through the room, highlighting barely visible engravings on the wall behind the chest. This map is not geographical. It rather resembles a genealogy, intertwining spirals and knots, marked not with names, but with enigmatic symbols. Perhaps it is a stylized tree or a complex labyrinth. In any case, it is alive through these connections. A strange, almost curious warmth now fills the room, as if the walls themselves are reacting to the lamplight, exhaling the secrets they have held for so long in their cold silence. The monk points to one of the nodes, marked with the image of the serpent star. It is located neither at the root of this labyrinth nor at its end. It seems to hover somewhere in the middle, representing a key node where various paths converge. Some marginal theorists argue that this is direct evidence of a parallel command structure within the Templar order, a secret brotherhood whose purpose was to preserve a special bloodline. This order operated invisibly, hidden beneath the visible hierarchy of knights, commanders, and grand masters. It was a network of guardians whose oaths were sworn not to Rome, but directly to this bloodline. A secret hidden within another secret. In the depths of one's consciousness, one can almost hear the skepticism of modern historians. It's just an allegory, they would say, a medieval meditation on spiritual rebirth. But then the question arises, why hide it in such a deep vault beneath an abbey, to code it, seal it, and pass it from hand to hand only in whispers? The monk carefully closes the chest. He does not lock it. There is no need. The weight of centuries of tradition is stronger than any iron lock. One gets the feeling that if someone was meant to open these chests, they would certainly know, and if not, the chest would simply refuse to reveal its story. As you ascend back into the main monastery courtyard, the contrast with the outside world is striking. Sunlight bathes the ancient flagstones, and a chorus of distant bells reminds one of the world above. Markets, political intrigues, sermons, and pervasive skepticism. But beneath your feet, the quiet, defiant bloodline continues its silent pilgrimage. There is a theory, whispered in certain circles, that not all bloodlines are recorded in official royal registers. Some are preserved by choice, not by right of crown. These are families who, for generations, have consciously foregone titles, estates, and renown, weaving themselves into the everyday fabric of villages, abbeys, and merchant guilds. The serpent star pendants are not relics of pride. They are rather compasses, quiet reminders of a responsibility that outlives any glory. Before you leave, the monk gently places a hand on your shoulder. He says nothing. He doesn't need to. This touch is a kind of acknowledgement, a shared understanding that history is not a straight line. It twists, it hides, and then it reappears. As you step out into the sunlight, you realize that you now look at the surrounding landscape completely differently. Every stone chapel, every market square, even the worn carvings on the well rim, these are no longer just background scenery. They are witnesses. The bloodline was never about dominion or conquest. Its essence is endurance. It is a legacy that survives not through force, but through its fluidity, hidden beneath the surface, like an underground stream that reshapes rock with whisper after whisper. And now you carry a part of that current. The path leads you higher, into the picturesque folds of the Languedoc hills, where the wind becomes an accomplice, carrying whispers through the cypress groves. You stand before the ruins of a chapel, its roof long succumbed to the destructive effects of time, but its stone skeleton stubbornly stands, arching its ribs towards the sky. This is not a place where tourists come. There are no information boards, no organized tours, only the slow decay of history left to the mercy of the elements. But beneath this apparent abandonment, something subtly pulsates. You step inside. The air here is colder, thicker. Light softens, filtering through shattered arches and painting fragmented mosaics of gold and gray on the floor. Immediately, there is a sense of being watched. Although there is no one here, at least no one visible, the chapel nave stretches forward, the floor paved with ancient flagstones, worn smooth by centuries of countless steps. But your guide, the quiet brother who followed you from the abbey, points not forward, but down. He gestures to a slab near the altar, its edges marked with symbols. A cross, yes, but intertwined with a serpent, an 8-pointed star nestled comfortably in its curves. Marginal historians call this symbol the mark of guardianship. Academic mainstream dismisses it as a simple decorative element, a local craftsman's deviation, they say. But you begin to understand that it is precisely in such deviations that truth loves to hide. With some effort, the slab slides open, revealing a narrow descent into a chamber that looks more like a wound in the earth than an ordinary room. You descend, the air growing colder, until the walls begin to gleam with moisture. Before your eyes, a stone platform was revealed, upon which rested a mysterious chalice. It lacked the usual attributes of luxury, neither the gleam of gold nor the sparkle of precious stones. Only stone, its harsh gray hue cut by thin crimson veins, as if the very material held echoes of ancient blood imprinted in its structure. The modesty of its appearance deceptively contrasted with its undeniable dominance in the surrounding space. This was not merely an exhibit designed to evoke fleeting interest, but a powerful, silent statement. Among researchers, it is believed that such stone chalices were ordinary medieval vessels intended for the sacrament of communion, created solely for practical and functional reasons. However, others, more inclined to mystical interpretations, whisper that these artifacts served as vessels of a bloodline, intended to hold not wine, but something far more sacred, a legacy, blood in its most literal and holy sense. The observer approached, feeling the magnetism of this place. Around this central elevation, directly in the stone floor, a labyrinth was skillfully carved, its spiral patterns radiating outwards. Its lines were so thin and delicate that they seemed almost erased by the relentless passage of time. The true purpose of this labyrinth was not to confuse or mislead, but to allow a certain path to be traced. It represented a kind of bloodline map, surprisingly accurately replicating the glyphs of the serpent star previously encountered in the halls of the monastic vault. At this point, researchers' opinions diverged sharply. One predominant school of thought suggested that the labyrinth served as a guide to Templar bloodline refugees, marking a secret pilgrimage route that stretched from the majestic Pyrenees to the rugged highlands of Scotland. Another theory, possessing far greater poeticism and depth, asserted that this stone pattern symbolized the inner journey of a chosen bloodline, a path of spiritual awakening, skillfully encoded in eternal stone. The traveler knelt beside the winding labyrinth, carefully tracing one of its thin lines with a finger. Under the touch, the stone felt unusually warm, its temperature seeming unnatural for an ancient monolith. At this moment, his thoughts returned to the image of the scribe in the abbey library, to the mysterious serpent tokens, and to the pendant he had held earlier. All of this, he believed, was not merely disparate relics, but rather deliberate breadcrumbs left for those who could find and understand them. Above, through the ruined skeletal rafters of the ancient structure, the sky began to change. Clouds slowly parted, and a powerful beam of light, as if guided by an invisible hand, pierced the ruins, falling directly onto the chalice. The crimson veins in the chalice's stone began to glow faintly, resembling smoldering, disturbed embers. One could attribute this to a random coincidence, but such an explanation would seem too superficial and lazy. Everything in this place seemed designed for such amazing moments to occur. As the observer rose, his guide, who had remained silent for several hours, finally spoke. "It is not hidden," he said, his voice quiet but imbued with unwavering firmness. "It merely waits." This concise yet profound phrase remained in the mind as the traveler ascended back into the sunlight, leaving the gloom of the ruins. Historians typically tend to portray the Templars either as skilled bankers, valiant warriors, or political pawns skillfully used in games of power. However, the idea that they perceived themselves as guardians, true custodians of an entity that transcended mundane notions of gold and worldly power, is not as romantic as it might seem at first glance. On the contrary, it is quite inconvenient, as it disrupts established, neat historical narratives, offering an entirely different interpretation of their role. Imagine that the chalice, hidden beneath these ancient ruins, is ultimately not the Holy Grail in its traditional Arthurian sense, but rather an anchor for an entire bloodline. It is a vessel that symbolizes continuity and succession, serving as a physical marker of a line that consciously chose patience and resilience over fleeting power and might. In light of such an interpretation, the Templars appear not as mere guardians of a relic, but as guardians of the choice itself, the choice of a path different from the accepted one. As the observer moved away from the ancient chapel, its unseen weight seemed to follow him. Every stone, every engraved symbol, every whispering gust of wind seemed to him a fragment of an unfinished sentence, awaiting its final completion. Memories of the labyrinth, that map which was not truly a map in the usual sense, led to a profound realization. History was never about finding a final destination. It was rather about being able to read between the lines, to understand the hidden interstices. The bloodline is not just a relic, waiting to be discovered and excavated. It is a complex pattern, a recurring rhythm, an unbroken thread that loops back on itself, adamantly refusing to be torn apart. And it was in these ruins, open to the boundless sky and breathing eternity, that this thread continued to pulsate palpably. The road gently sloped down into the valley, where the sunlight transformed, taking on a softer golden hue, a sign of the afternoon lull. Underfoot, the stones felt warm, as if the earth itself breathed slow, measured sighs. The traveler continued along the path, framed by slender cypresses and fragrant lavender. Each new gust of wind released a symphony of subtle aromas, the freshness of herbs, the smell of heated dust, and the faint taste of old frankincense, as if wafting from some long-forgotten altar. Ahead, amidst the greenery, a manor house appeared, but its appearance did not resemble a majestic royal castle at all. It was something far more subtle and multifaceted, a structure that combined the features of a stern fortress and a secluded sanctuary. Its ochre stone walls were overgrown with thick ivy, and the towers, though modest in size, looked vigilant, like guardians. Once, this place served as a Templar commandery, although at present it skillfully disguised itself as an ordinary wine estate. Local residents, of course, only exchanged hushed whispers about its ancient past, especially when wine flowed freely, loosening tongues. A woman emerged to meet the traveler, neither a nun nor a knight in the traditional sense, but rather a simple guardian of this place. She was dressed in a humble robe, her hands stained with grape must, but her gaze remained sharp and penetrating, like the blade of a well-sharpened sword. She led him into the inner courtyard, where the air was thick with the rich, blended aromas of ripening fruit and cooling stone, creating a unique atmosphere. "The heart of this estate," she said, her voice calm and steady, "lies not in its grapevines, but deep beneath them. The true harvests gathered here are not meant for bottling and sale." Then she moved a massive stone slab located near an old well, revealing a narrow, spiral staircase that descended into impenetrable shadow. As they descended, the walls grew colder and damper, and a low, barely perceptible hum resonated around them, as if the earth itself was awakening and beginning to remember long past events. Deep in the dungeon, torches flared, their flickering light dancing over ancient frescoes, whose preservation seemed astonishing and even incredible for such a long period. However, these were not triumphant scenes of knights valiantly fighting in crusades, nor sorrowful depictions of martyrdom, so beloved by church artists of past centuries. No, before their eyes were maps. Intricate, deeply symbolic serpentine patterns depicting bloodlines not as traditional genealogical trees, but as continuous flowing rivers that twisted, merged into a single stream, and then diverged in different directions. One of these symbolic rivers particularly captivated the observer's attention. It meandered, passing through symbols already familiar to him: the twisting serpent, the eight-pointed star, the mysterious chalice, and next to them, something entirely new, an image of a tree, whose mighty roots entwined around a crown. This was a bold, audacious statement, skillfully expressed with ancient pigments on cold walls. Official historians tend to dismiss these frescoes, viewing them as allegorical, skillfully executed reflections on the spiritual journeys of the human soul. However, representatives of less conventional scientific circles see in them something far more concrete and precise. They perceive a complex visual code that indicates the continuity of sacred bloodlines, passed down through generations of dynasties, carefully concealed under the guise of ordinary aristocratic origin. The woman draws attention to a barely visible symbol, skillfully incorporated into the composition in one of the corners, a red cross entwined with a laurel wreath. This, she says, never served as a sign of military conflict. It was a personal signature, an unambiguous statement of kinship. Her speech remained unperturbed, as if she were discussing a harvest, not the potential descendants of a person widely believed to be childless. It is no wonder that heated debates rage around this issue. Some researchers insist that the Templars used such symbols to affirm spiritual succession, not genetic kinship. Others, representatives of less recognized academic circles, believe that these were direct indications of blood ties, carefully encrypted in allegorical images to ensure their preservation and safety. The narrator feels a familiar, almost palpable burden settle on his chest again. The same burden she, had felt in the hidden crypts beneath the ancient abbey, the same as in the intricate labyrinths of the old chapel. Each new place reveals another connecting thread, another echo of long-past events. In the center of the mysterious chamber stood a wooden chest, its lid decorated with an intricate carving depicting a star entwined with a serpent. It had no locks, only a modest dark red wax seal with a clear impression of a laurel cross. The woman carefully lifts the lid, revealing inside not glittering gold ingots or precious stones, but ancient scrolls, many of them tightly bound. Their goatskin covers were noticeably worn, and the edges darkened by countless touches, having survived centuries. The narrator reaches for one of them, feeling the rough yet surprisingly familiar texture. The writing was neither Latin nor Old Occitan, but a carefully encrypted text, a special alphabet of symbols that only occasionally appeared in the margins of ancient Templar manuscripts. It was a language created not for direct reading, but for deep memorization, a complex code passed down by word of mouth, preserved in people's memories, not just on parchment. Among researchers, there are fierce debates about whether these complex ciphers were ever fully deciphered. Some specialists insist that sacred knowledge was deliberately divided and transmitted in parts from generation to generation, with each guardian possessing only a fragment of the whole. Others believe that the complete code was preserved in oral traditions, skillfully disguised as harmless folk tales or solemn chants performed during harvest festivals. The narrator involuntarily imagines the Templar Knights, after their tragic fall, scattering across the continent like smoldering embers, carrying with them a piece of a scroll, a melody of a song, or a crumb of history, dissolving into the vast and diverse fabric of European society. Not completely destroyed, but merely skillfully silenced, hidden from prying eyes. As the narrator stands in this chamber with the scroll in hand, this profound concept takes on an almost physical tangibility. The bloodline, thus, appears not as some material relic requiring active searching, but as a complex, pervasive pattern, skillfully hidden in plain sight, in family customs, in ancient rituals, in barely audible whispered blessings that most perceive merely as simple superstitions. The guardian carefully closes the chest. "The wine, of course, ferments," she says with a barely perceptible sly smile on her lips. "However, some harvests are capable of breathing." Outside, the sun was already noticeably setting, casting long, whimsical shadows across the ground that, like long fingers, stretched into the valley, drawing secrets back into the earth. The narrator leaves the chamber, but the air around feels different, filled with a special heaviness, as if the earth itself is watching his departure, assessing its true significance. The Templars, it turns out, did not disappear without a trace. They permeated the roots of trees, seeped into ancient stones, intertwined with forgotten rituals, skillfully disguised as familiar local customs. The sacred bloodline never needed direct, obvious protection. It only required boundless patience. The narrator walks past rows of grapevines, their leaves rustling softly in the gentle breeze. Somewhere deep beneath his feet, these ancient scrolls continue to be preserved, patiently awaiting the next inquisitive mind that dares to ask a question that penetrates a little deeper than aloud. And the narrator, not for the first time, wonders if history's greatest secret lies not so much in careful concealment as in wisely waiting for the truly right questions to be asked. The wind here sounds different. Its melody seems higher, thinner, as if the air itself does not wish to carry sounds that hold centuries of secrets. The narrator stands atop Montségur, a fortress that served as a refuge not for kings, but, according to the chronicles of the victors, for heretics. The Cathars, known as the Pure, once inhabited this citadel, defiantly rising on a sheer rocky cliff that cuts the sky like a sharp blade. However, the narrator has come here not only for the Cathars, or at least not exclusively. The stone beneath his boots feels warm, almost alive, seemingly whispering stories of long sieges, treacherous betrayals, and, if these barely perceptible whispers are to be believed, of a treasure that was secretly spirited away right from under the nose of the all-powerful church. The thing is, Montségur became the place where the Knights Templar learned an invaluable lesson. When fortress walls begin to burn, the most sacred and valuable items must be evacuated beforehand. The sun shines brightly and mercilessly, but his guide, an old man whose voice resembled the crunch of gravel, leads him into a deep, shaded niche, roughly carved directly into the rock. His torch flares with a quiet, dry crackle, illuminating a narrow tunnel that spirals deep downwards, where the damp, cold air envelops the traveler like a burial shroud. Each step in this passage feels like an inhale and exhale, and with each such inhale, the inescapable weight of centuries of history is felt. According to ancient traditions, it was here that the Cathars passed on to the Templars something far more valuable than mere gold. Perhaps it was a sacred secret, a priceless relic, an ancient scroll, or perhaps even a living person. A precise inventory, of course, has not survived, and therein lies the whole point. The narrator reaches a chamber where the air seems unnaturally still, devoid of any movement. An 8-pointed star, entwined with a serpent, is skillfully carved into the wall, and beneath this symbol rests a massive stone slab, polished to a shine by countless touches of reverent hands over the centuries. Representatives of official historical science, guided by their predictable pragmatism, skeptically dismiss this, considering it merely symbolic Cathar art, a simple aesthetic motif, completely devoid of any deep hidden meaning. However, marginal researchers and theorists put forth a different hypothesis, that this place served as a secret meeting point, a kind of transfer station, where valuable relics, connected to both Cathar and Templar bloodlines, were handed over to new, trusted guardians, safely away from the all-consuming inquisitorial pyres. Quiet understanding and ancient secrets. The guide, your companion on this journey, does not strive for verbal explanations. His smile is more a question, a silent plea for understanding. From his travel bag, he extracts a map made of goatskin. Time has not spared its ink, which has faded, but the geometric patterns remain strikingly clear. This is not an ordinary topographic map of earthly territories, but rather a diagram of sacred alignments, stellar configurations, unseen ley lines, and sanctuaries scattered across France, Spain, and beyond, as if stitched together by invisible threads. The guide points to the location of Montségur. They called it the Castle of the Grail, he says in a low voice, not because a golden chalice was kept there, but because of the Grail itself. The old Occitan word means vessel, a receptacle for some sacred essence that is not necessarily a material object. Perhaps it refers to a bloodline. To this day, fierce debates continue in academic circles about whether the supposed alliance between the Cathars and Templars was anything more than a romantic fabrication, a post-Crusades fantasy born of those who reject the neat Roman historical narratives. However, the coinciding timelines, overlapping routes, and recurring symbols point to a coordination that seems too precise to be mere coincidence. The air inside the stone chamber grows noticeably colder, as if the mountain itself is attentively listening to what is happening. Your fingers glide over the surface of the stone slab, feeling grooves that have worn much deeper than one would expect. These patterns speak of repeated use, of rituals performed not once, but hundreds of times. The guide kneels, presses his hand against the slab, and it slides open, revealing a cavity hidden beneath. Inside, on velvet long faded to gray, rests a bronze reliquary box, adorned with a cross entwined with laurel branches. Its lid silently lifts, revealing a single item, a ring, not gold, but iron. Its band is etched with serpent glyphs and inlaid with a stone the color of dried blood. Simple, inconspicuous, it would hold no interest for looters. But for those who understand the language of symbols, this ornament is a miniature coronation. You lift the ring, feeling its weight, or rather its surprising lightness. Such a ring is easy to hide, even easier to pass down, and quite simple to dismiss its significance. Some researchers claim that the idea of a Grail bloodline is pure myth, a misinterpretation of poetic metaphors gone wild. However, these same scholars cannot explain why in certain families, living in specific valleys, prayers are still uttered that mention the mother of the lineage, centuries after official doctrine consigned her to oblivion. As you return the ring to its resting place, the guide almost casually mentions that similar rings have been found in places as distant as Scotland and Portugal. Is this a coincidence? Or is it a widespread network? Or perhaps it is simply artifacts of a belief system that refused to die, no matter how many towers were burned. Outside, the wind has changed direction again. Now it has intensified, as if reminding us that the history of Montségur is not just an ancient relic. It is a living tension, a thread that still vibrates beneath the surface, echoing in stone and blood. You step out into the sunlight, blinking, but the shadow of that chamber clings to you. Each step down the mountainside feels heavier, as if gravity pulls with double force. Now you begin to understand why the Templars preferred to hide their treasures in plain sight, not in secure vaults, but in rituals, in songs, and in humble rings worn by farmers and stonemasons. And you begin to wonder how many people pass by these symbols every day, their eyes clouded by centuries of enforced forgetting, while the true guardians quietly smile, aware of the full significance of what they carry. The valley below stretches out like an endless canvas. It is a patchwork quilt of green and gold, woven with the same patterns you saw on the ancient map. History has not ended. It has simply changed its language. You stand on the edge of a windswept cliff. The Pyrenees sprawl below, like a tapestry carved from stone. The air is filled with the scents of salt and mountain sage. Somewhere far below, ancient paths wind through ravines where whispers have accumulated in the moss for centuries. Today we do not look down at past centuries. We turn our gaze upward to the high vaults of history, where a secret dynasty once hovered beneath papal thrones and royal crowns. Imagine a coronation in Avignon, but not the pomp of golden scepters, rather a veiled ceremony within stone walls, known only to an elect few. A bloodline traced not by scrolls, but by the carefully guarded breath of people sworn to silence. A Templar bloodline, flowing in the veins of kings, yet declared invisible by decree of Rome. Some historians will tell you this is pure legend, that dynasties are forged by armies and treaties, not by hidden parchments and secret rites. But if you listen to the archivists of Rennes-le-Château, they will point you to the Testament of the Shepherd, a goatskin document sealed with 8-pointed stars, where bloodlines twist from Jerusalem through Merovingian vaults into the hands of a Templar named Bertrand. He was not of noble birth. He was a stonemason, a keeper of the cipher. Imagine Bertrand, lantern in hand, walking through an underground chamber beneath a forgotten Languedoc monastery. The walls are rough, unpolished by wealth, but his steps are sure. He knows where the vault is, not with gold, but with a carved reliquary bearing a symbol the church calls heresy. A chalice entwined with vines, guarded by a serpent. The tension between what is carved in stone and what is preached is palpable, isn't it? Here in the cool breath of stone, Templar artisans expressed their protest not with swords, but with chisel strokes that would outlast papal edicts. Bertrand's hands, calloused from lime dust, were the hands of a king, a quiet rebel. And yet, while scholars debate whether such reliquaries even existed, a collapsed abbey vault reveals frescoes that do not fit the official narrative. Serpents embracing stars, crosses entwined with vines. To the casual eye, it's just a crumbling medieval fresco. To the guardian of the bloodline, it's a map. Ecclesiastical hierarchies often sought to categorize such symbols, classifying them as popular delusions or heresies, as if the very essence of faith could be confined, sorted, and shelved. However, true faith is inherently elusive and mutable. It lurks in ancient stone crevices, seeps through whispered prayers, and patiently awaits those with a special, discerning gaze. Thus, Bertrand's reliquary was erased from official annals and forgotten. Yet, despite centuries of oblivion, it re-emerged from the shadows centuries later, materializing in secret whispers about the serpent chalice passed from hand to hand among French resistance priests, carefully hidden beneath liturgical vestments during clandestine masses. Irony, sharp and poignant, wove itself into these legends like a precious golden thread. The very relic that was once condemned and rejected by official Rome now attained sacred status thanks to those who bravely risked their lives to save and preserve it. The surrounding air gradually grew piercingly cold, and one could almost feel the icy chill penetrate Bertrand's thick cloak as he meticulously sealed the secret vault for the last time, pressing a crimson wax seal firmly against the rough stone slab. The wax itself was ordinary, yet the gesture held profound significance. It was a silent farewell to an entire bloodline, now destined to survive in the utter shadows. Above him, the monastery bells rang anxiously, but their chime did not mark the passage of time. On the contrary, it heralded impending danger. The Inquisition, all-powerful and merciless, lurked everywhere. Bertrand, however, does not flee in the usual sense of the word. He dissolves into the labyrinths of underground tunnels, plunges into a whirlpool of myths, and finds anonymity in the powerful guild of builders, whose unseen tentacles stretch to every cathedral across vast Europe. Some skeptics are inclined to argue that these narratives are merely a whimsical blend of a dozen unrelated threads, mystical orders, political exiles, apocryphal gospels, skillfully woven into a grand tapestry of an overarching conspiracy. Perhaps so, but then a legitimate question arises. Why does the same enigmatic symbol of the serpent chalice invariably appear in majestic cathedrals 3 centuries later, on completely different continents, and always precisely in those places where the tireless hands of the Templars once worked stone? And why does Bertrand's name unexpectedly surface in Parisian archives centuries later, recorded not as the name of an ordinary stonemason, but as the name of a keeper of sacred vessels? Indeed, it is very easy to get lost in these labyrinths of assumptions, endless maybes and might-have-beens. However, this evening, in the deep silence, broken only by the measured beat of the heart, one should walk these mysterious paths with special reverence. Imagine that Bertrand's lantern still emits its faint light somewhere beneath this abbey, not just a relic of the past, but a living torch, passed from hand to hand by those who stubbornly refuse to forget. The bells gradually fall silent, the fog thickens, and in this ensuing quiet, the ancient bloodline continues to breathe invisibly. The traveler follows the map, not only with sight, but also feeling it with their breath, the tips of their fingers. The parchment feels almost alive, as if each fold and every ink stroke carries a pulse, leading the explorer not just to a geographical point, but to a specific, fateful moment. This is not merely a trail marked by familiar boundaries and thoroughfares, but rather a path woven from symbols, serpents, stars, chalices, organically intertwined into the very fabric of forgotten corners of old Europe. Each such symbol serves as an invisible door, and at this very moment, the explorer stands directly before one of them. Ahead, carved directly into the basalt rock, rises a monastery. Its presence is so modest and inconspicuous that it seems to dissolve, disappearing in plain sight. Locals have long called it the Hollow Abbey, a place where light and shadow, intertwining, weave mysterious stories directly onto the stone. He passes through an arched gateway, whose keystone is adorned with a Templar cross, skillfully entwined with a serpent, a symbol that still sparks heated debates among learned scholars. Was it merely a common motif of medieval artisans, or a veiled emblem of an ancient doctrine that blended Christian wisdom with pre-Christian knowledge? This debate, raging in academic circles, echoes faintly in ivory towers. And yet here, in this place, it is forever carved directly into the living rock, remaining motionless and unperturbed in the face of any scientific discussions. The abbey breathes cool, damp air, and its ancient walls seem to exude secrets they have carefully guarded ever since the last Templar caravan passed through here. And in this ringing echo, a dry, rustling laugh involuntarily escapes the explorer's chest. This path is not merely old, it is alive, and it silently laughs at those who naively believe that history can be forever buried. He enters the scriptorium. A profound silence reigns here, broken only by the faint scratching of quills, long silenced, whose ghostly rhythm still lingers in the air like a distant memory. Shelves sag heavily under the impressive weight of ancient parchment manuscripts. Here are herbals, cosmologies, and those peculiar hybrid texts that scholars so readily classify as pseudepigrapha when their content does not conform to accepted expectations and footnotes. And there it is, a panel of the stone wall, noticeably smoother than its neighbors, completely devoid of dust, as if it had merely awaited its hour. He presses a bronze token, an image of a serpent entwined around a chalice, into a corresponding indentation. The wall lets out a slow, prolonged groan, reluctantly revealing its hinge, and a hidden passage breathes piercingly cold air onto his skin. The scent lingering in the air seems familiar to him. Old paper, beeswax, and something metallic. Perhaps it was a blood memory, awakened from the depths of centuries. Inside this chamber, a striking modesty reigns. There are no gilded altars, no jewel-encrusted reliquaries, only a simple, unadorned wooden chest. Its lock is an image of a serpent devouring its own tail, the Ouroboros. Some historians argue that the Templars may have adopted this symbol from Gnostic sects. Others vehemently reject it as pagan nonsense. However, here it is neither. It is both a key and a warning, and at the same time a promise. He opens the chest. No fanfare sounds, no divine light flashes. Only a bundle of scrolls, tied with red silk and sealed with crimson wax. The seal bears the image of an 8-pointed star, an emblem that refuses to be tamed by any single faith or faction. Christians, Sufis, Kabbalists, all have tried to appropriate it. And yet here it remains, quietly indifferent, as if silently asking the researcher who he is to define it. The scrolls unfold with palpable reluctance, revealing a map that is not, in essence, an ordinary map. It is more a constellation, meticulously inscribed on the earth itself. It marks ancient pilgrimage lines, like veins of ley lines, and nodes where sacred geometry seems to kiss the solid ground. He carefully traces this intricate pattern. Rennes-le-Château, Orval Abbey, the Church of Mary Magdalene in Vézelay. This was a triangulation of stories too incredible to be included in textbooks, yet too persistent to remain mere legends. A faint smile appears on his face. Some might call this a pointless, wild goose chase, but he knows better. Geese fly in formation, and even in their apparent chaos, there is surprising precision. The moment the researcher carefully rolled up the ancient scroll, a soft crunch echoed under his boot. A small splinter of wood had given way. The man's gaze dropped, discovering a tiny bronze serpent that had once adorned the old chest, and now found its freedom. The miniature metal figure seemed to grin at him, as if offering a subtle joke or an important reminder. In the mystical world of the Templars, as is known, even the most insignificant, damaged objects could be profound symbols, awaiting interpretation. Leaving the chamber, he noticed how the surrounding light had transformed. Shadows stretched, filled with deep, rich hues. Outside, the abbey seemed to silently observe what was happening, remaining indifferent, yet all-knowing. Somewhere far beyond the rocky ledges, in other corners of the world, other seekers of truth moved along their own threads of the same tangled web. The researcher involuntarily wondered if they shared his irony towards the scholars, who to this day hotly debate whether the Templars meticulously guarded some sacred secrets or merely stumbled upon them by chance. Meanwhile, the serpent token felt significantly heavier in his palm, not in weight, but in the colossal burden of history it carried. Now the path led downwards, into the ancient catacombs located beneath the quiet, as if immersed in eternal sleep, village of Rennes-le-Château. The air that permeated these catacombs was not merely cool, it was palpably ancient. Imbued with the breath of bygone eras, it seemed to cling to the skin, to blow on the back of the neck, bringing with it a complex bouquet of aromas, damp limestone, long extinguished candle wax, and a faint metallic tang. The researcher's steps echoed in strange, broken rhythms, creating the impression that the very bones of history were shifting to listen attentively to uninvited guests. The stone steps, worn by countless centuries, spiraled deep downwards, like an auger relentlessly drilling into the very heart of the earth. Every inch of the walls was generously adorned with intricate carvings. Among them were images of saints, their faces softened and smoothed by centuries of ubiquitous moisture, as well as enigmatic symbols that did not conform to the canons of any known church. The man carefully traced his fingers along a shallow groove, following the elegant lines of an 8-pointed star, skillfully intertwined with a serpent. This was undoubtedly sacred geometry, but of an entirely different kind, not one that would ever receive Rome's approval. High above, like the rib cage of some colossal, slumbering beast, stretched a vaulted ceiling, whose curved stone ribs reliably sheltered this hidden sanctuary. In the carefully hewn niches adorning the walls, numerous effigies rested, slowly crumbling under the onslaught of time. Here one could see figures of knights with broken swords, and saints whose once shining halos now flickered barely perceptibly, reduced to a pale hint of former glory. However, the researcher's discerning eye caught something entirely different, something beyond the usual. Among the traditional Christian images, much more mysterious and unusual forms were skillfully embedded. There was a figure of a woman, her body entwined with ivy, symbolizing, perhaps, nature or ancient cults. Next to her, a man holding not a sword, as befits a warrior, but a mysterious chalice. And finally, the image of a child, on whose chest a star seemed to be branded. These were, without a doubt, stories once banished from official scriptures, but which managed to survive and be imprinted here, in eternal stone. Some researchers suggest that these catacombs originally had a Roman origin, later re-equipped and adapted by the early Merovingians. Other scholars persistently argue that these underground structures predate even the pagan era, representing ancient druidic chambers that were repeatedly rebuilt and restored layer by layer, like a palimpsest of forgotten beliefs and cultures. However, local legends, those usually whispered after copious libations of wine and in the dim light of candles, tell a completely different story. They speak of valiant Templar knights who, fleeing the fiery Inquisition and righteous papal wrath, concealed here not just untold treasures of gold and silver. Legends say they buried something far more dangerous and valuable, a sacred bloodline, living flesh, carefully hidden beneath an unbreakable mountain of oaths and securely tucked away under the eternal stone shell of these ancient vaults. In one corner, beneath a massive arch that seemed to have sagged under the weight of countless years, stood a font. However, this was not a font intended for holy water, not of gleaming marble adorned with cherubs. Before their eyes was an imposing chalice of black basalt, its surface intricately carved with intertwining vines and serpents whose tails cunningly tied, forming the outline of an inverted chalice. The sharp, bitter scent of myrrh still lingered in the air, creating the sensation that an ancient ritual had just concluded, or perhaps never truly ceased. The researcher almost vividly imagined hooded figures silently circling this unusual font, whispering words in a language that distorted Latin, transforming it into something much older and deeper. It became clear this was not a place for traditional baptism. It was a sanctuary of anointing, of secure protection, and of deep concealment. Then the researcher's gaze suddenly caught a faint glint. A stone, only slightly ajar, revealed the existence of a secret cavity. Inside, a scroll was discovered, carefully sealed with wax, bearing an unmistakably recognizable seal, the red cross of the Templars, pierced by a silver dagger. The seal was cracked, but not completely broken, creating the impression that someone had once considered opening it, but at the last moment lacked the courage to see it through. The researcher felt a hesitation. To open this scroll now would mean to awaken echoes of long-past events, not meant for daylight. But was that not why they had come here, into these gloomy depths? Is not curiosity the oldest sin, that first inheritance passed down to humanity from Eve herself? Some scholars, in the comfortable security of their university chairs, unequivocally assert that all Templar legends associated with Rennes-le-Château are merely ingenious fabrications, born of the eccentricity of a 19th-century priest named Béranger Saunière. They persistently claim that his sensational discovery of mysterious parchments was nothing more than a clever ruse, an opportune pretext for illicit enrichment. However, here, in the gloom of the underground, by the flickering light of a torch that barely illuminates the ancient carved walls, such a theory seems not merely erroneous, but an outright insult. Stones of such unimaginable antiquity are incapable of lying. They simply have no need to. The researcher involuntarily recalled the chapel mentioned in Section 3. Those very inscriptions, over which they had puzzled for so long, which seemed more like intriguing riddles than traditional psalms, now acquired new meaning. They were not mere decorative elements. These engravings served as warnings, precise markers, indicating what lay hidden deep underground. And this font, this massive basalt chalice, was now perceived not merely as an ancient relic. It was a vessel specifically designed to hold blood. sacred, defiant blood, that which refused to be erased from the face of history. Suddenly, the air in the catacombs stirred almost imperceptibly, and a faint sound reached his ears, as if a tiny stone had shifted somewhere. But it was definitely not his own breath. The researcher froze, straining every nerve, trying to catch the slightest rustle, feeling the oppressive weight of the ancient catacombs pressing from all sides. Here, the walls did not merely serve as receptacles for the dead. They seemed to be listening intently. They vigilantly guarded their secrets. Or perhaps they were simply waiting. Ancient legends whispered of a child who was anointed here in deep secrecy, not with holy water, but with the very sanctity of an ancient bloodline. A child whose very existence would be the greatest heresy against the most zealously guarded truths of the Vatican. The question of whether this ancient bloodline of the child still flows in the veins of unsuspecting descendants is one no one dares voice aloud. However, the researcher wondered how many layers of history would have to be stripped away before the truth revealed itself to the world. His torch flickered, as if caught by a sudden gust of wind. The flames illuminated what had previously escaped his attention. A mosaic, half covered under a layer of debris and centuries of dust. He carefully brushed away the layers of dust, gradually revealing the image of a knight tenderly embracing a swaddled infant in the shadow of a colossal cross rising above the scene. However, this was not Christ. The infant's head was not adorned with a halo. Only a faint outline of a crown appeared on it. This was not a symbol of redemption or salvation. Rather, it was an image of deep mystery and concealment. There are suggestions that the Knights Templar once guarded relics of Solomon's temple. Others assert uncompromisingly that they protected the sangreal, not as a sacred chalice, but as sangreal, meaning royal blood. A bloodline passed down from generation to generation through flesh, not through artifacts. What if both of these statements are true? What if the true treasure was not gold or a mystical chalice, but a child, born with a name capable of shaking the power of monarchs and pontiffs? He paused, lost in thought over the mosaic, the ancient scroll, the font. Above, in the village church, a bell tolled, emitting a muffled, barely audible chime, as if echoing in the depths of the underground realm. Up there, life went on as usual. Market stalls bustled, quiet confessions were heard. The measured clicks of rosary beads kept their familiar rhythm. Here, underground, lay a different confession. One that the church had buried under centuries of prayers, but which the ancient stones and serpent symbols refused to forget. Footsteps echoed, this time distinct and undeniable. The researcher was no longer alone. The ancient catacombs, it seemed, never favored solitary guests. Perhaps it was a guardian, perhaps another seeker like himself, or perhaps, in such places, the line between them blurs more thinly than people would like to admit. Now he felt it distinctly. A low hum emanating from beneath the earth, a pulsation whose nature was not geological, but entirely due to what had been imprisoned for centuries. The Knights Templar may have vanished from the pages of historical chronicles, but in these ancient stones, in this silent chamber, their testament lives on. And as he ran his fingers over the cracked wax seal, he understood that some legacies are not merely unearthed, they are awakened to new life. By the time the monk returned with parchment, quill, and a partially spilled inkwell, The old knight's hands trembled too much to write. His fingers were gnarled, like brittle tree branches, stiffened by years and countless scars left by the sword. Yet his voice remained firm. It was not the authoritative command of a Templar captain, but the faint whisper of a man who had guarded a truth far more formidable than the edge of any blade throughout his life. Brother Mathieu settled beside him, dipping his quill into the inkwell, awaiting each word with the reverence of a student listening to sacred scripture. "Write," the knight said with effort. "Record that all monarchs fear what they do not possess. The Merovingians, for instance, claimed divine origin. But what is the true power of divine blood if it cannot be bought, subjugated, or ultimately hidden from the world?" Brother Mathieu's brow furrowed in confusion. "You mean the Grail bloodline?" The knight slowly nodded in affirmation. "They not only protected this lineage," he continued, "they were themselves a part of it, its embodiment. The Grail was not a sacred chalice, but a womb, a living vessel of flesh, a woman. Her descendants were persecuted not for their beliefs, but for the blood that flowed in their veins, blood that could someday provide legitimacy to a rival throne or an alternative ecclesiastical authority. The wind outside howled, lashing the stone walls, as if mourning the heavy burden of past times. The fire in the hearth dwindled to a dull red ember. Brother Mathieu hastily wrote down the words, stopping only when the knight's voice broke or his mind turned to images of long-gone faces, people who had died in nameless battles. "The church feared corruption, that is true," the knight continued. "But even more, it feared exposure. That beneath the gilded mitres and holy relics, the truth had long penetrated depths beyond their control and influence. That a descendant of Mary Magdalene still lives among people." He closed his eyes for a moment. His chest rose and fell gently, like a receding tide. "When we sailed from the Holy Land, we delivered something far more significant than mere relics. We brought parchments, seals, bones, yes, but also something far more sacred, the living memory of a bloodline that was not a myth, not a poetic metaphor, but real flesh and concrete names." Brother Mathieu's hand froze above the page. "You have the names." "I," the knight whispered, "have the names and a map, hidden in plain sight, right beneath our feet. Not a line drawn on parchment, but carved into the geometry of space. The true map is the church itself. Its walls, layout, floor stones, axes, ancient rites, deeply encrypted in its architectural solutions." Mathieu blinked, clearly puzzled by what he heard. "You see," the knight continued, "Rennes-le-Château was built not only to praise the Almighty, but also to guard certain gates. Beneath it is a Roman temple, and even deeper, something even more archaic, a chamber sealed with 8 massive iron bolts, one for each of the 8 knights entrusted with guarding this secret." The wind intensified, turning into a piercing howl, and somewhere outside, a bell swung on its rope by itself, emitting a faint, ghostly chime, though no hand set it in motion. The knight opened one eye slightly. "They will come," he said. "Not simple peasants, but others, those who patiently wait in silence. Direct descendants of those very 8 knights. When they feel the sacred seal weakening, when one of us dies, they will reunite." He suddenly grabbed the monk's hand with force, his eyes burning with a feverish fire. They must not fall into the hands of monarchs, ecclesiastical hierarchs, or Rome itself. The child must be hidden, protected, taught to remember unconsciously, taught symbols, not dogmas, stories, not sermons. This is the only way. The child, Mathieu asked. Is this ancient line still unbroken? The knight, his breath betraying extreme weariness, leaned even closer to the monk, almost touching his cheek. Yes, he rasped, and what you seek is far closer than you might imagine. He began to list clues indicating a hidden network or knowledge. Look for those families that always stood apart, never fitting into accepted norms. Pay attention to midwives who suddenly disappear, as if dissolving into thin air. Notice stonemasons whose skill surpasses their remuneration, carving something more than just stones on commission. Look for women who speak Latin, even though their lives have been spent solely within their native village. Finally, pay attention to boys whose dreams are filled with images of lions and stars, despite no one ever having told them these ancient tales. His body slumped again, as if having expended the last vestiges of life energy. The sudden surge of strength that had just sustained him now completely faded, giving way to an exhausting weariness, like a receding tide leaving behind only a desolate shore. Brother Mathieu, in turn, fixed his gaze on the parchment, which was now densely covered with ink, holding both recorded words and unsettling, mysterious warnings. He felt an irresistible urge to ask many more questions, but the knight had already closed his eyes, his lips barely moving in a silent prayer. Moments passed slowly. The candle flame seemed to sink even lower, threatening to extinguish at any moment. Then, from deep beneath the chapel, the knight whispered again, his voice barely audible, "The ossuary of the forgotten, where the remains of many generations rest. Move the fourth skull, counting from the left. Behind it, you will find a lock. Use the token in my bag. It will open the great gate leading to what is hidden." Mathieu, seized by a premonition of something monumental, wrote even faster, his hand barely keeping pace with the dying man's words, causing the ink to smudge in places on the parchment. Inside, the knight continued, his voice growing weaker, "You will find a bronze star. But remember, this is not the relic itself that many seek, but merely a key, a complex cipher. Place it on any of the ancient Templar maps, and the map will reveal its true secrets itself. The truth must be known. The Grail was never lost. It was skillfully hidden in a legacy passed down from generation to generation." The fire in the hearth crackled, providing the only sound in the room. The knight, his eyes now acquiring a glassy, vacant sheen, smiled faintly. "And one last thing, brother," he whispered, gathering his remaining strength. Mathieu, without hesitation, leaned even closer so as not to miss a word. "They will surely try to distort this," the knight said, his voice now barely audible. "The Vatican, powerful kings, even the Masons, all will strive to alter the truth. But remember this. Truth does not require a magnificent cathedral to stand unshaken. It needs only memory, carefully guarded, and a whisper, delivered at the opportune moment. Now you have become that whisper." With these words, his head slumped to the side, and at that very moment, the candle flame flickered and died, plunging the room into semi-darkness. A deep, deathly silence fell, broken only by Brother Mathieu's quick, ragged breaths. He gently closed the knight's eyelids, paying a final tribute, and then pulled his cloak over the lifeless face. Suddenly, without apparent cause, the bell rang again, though no one was in the bell tower to set it in motion. And far beneath the chapel, where ancient bones and forgotten stone had rested for centuries, A faint but distinct metallic click echoed in the utter darkness, surprisingly similar to the sound of a key turning after long centuries of waiting. The dawn of spring, usually marked by the joyful singing of birds, arrived in deep silence that day. The very silence that hangs in the air, like a breath held too long, but not from fear, but from the deepest reverence for something great and inevitable. Far from human eyes, beyond the ruined apse of ancient monastic ruins, beneath thick, intertwined ivy, and behind rusty gates that groaned like a death rattle when moved, lay a forgotten garden. Various legends were told about it. Some claimed it once belonged to the abbess of Montségur, an outstanding Cathar woman of rare erudition. She, according to legends, knew the ancient names of stars and the old names of medicinal plants whose properties had long been lost to most. Others persistently claimed that this garden was sown with earth brought from Jerusalem itself, earth carried by weary but mysterious Templars, returning from the Holy Land not only with valuable relics, but also with sacred secrets intended for the chosen few. Father Magdalene arrived as the first morning mist, like the finest silk, enveloped the tender grass, lending a mystical hue to the entire landscape. He had been traveling since midnight, guided by an ancient map drawn on sheepskin. This map was special. Its inscriptions were not in familiar Latin, but in an enigmatic, secret language belonging only to the companions of the veil. This language was not words, but a complex system of symbols, skillfully superimposed on geometric figures and geometry itself, shrouded in deep, sacred silence, comprehensible only to the initiated. The garden itself was a perfect square, each side precisely 24 paces long. At its corners lay carved stones bearing symbols, faded by time but still discernible, a chalice, a sword, an image of the sun's radiance, and a mysterious 8-pointed star. In the very center of this sacred space, a single rose bush proudly bloomed. It was utterly unlike the common roses one might find in other gardens. Its petals were colored a deep, almost black, dark red. Not the hue of passion, but rather the color of old, dried, and consecrated blood, carrying an ancient mystery. These unique roses bloomed only once a year, precisely on Mary Magdalene's feast day, and only for those who bore a special mark, testifying to their belonging to the chosen. Magdalene slowly approached the bush, removing his glove. The scar on his palm, long faded with time, still appeared, in certain light, as a distinct mark, a tiny brand in the shape of a double cross enclosed in a circle. It had been burned into his skin in childhood, during a ritual he barely remembered, retaining only fragments of memories, stone water, an iron chalice, and a solemn oath uttered in 3 different languages. As his hand hovered over the rose bloom, a wind arose, not an ordinary earthly gust, but an ancient one, like the whisper of centuries sweeping through the yew trees that bordered the garden. The rose petals trembled, and from their deep folds, a faint golden gleam appeared. It was a scroll tube, surprisingly thin, no longer than a finger, sealed at both ends with red wax and bearing the clear mark of a lion, the symbol of the house of de Béziers. For a moment he hesitated. The house of de Béziers, as is known, had been completely destroyed during the Albigensian Crusade. Its extensive lands were confiscated, and its descendants scattered or ruthlessly killed. However, their ancient blood had not vanished without a trace. It had merely gone deep underground, carefully preserved, protected, and passed down from generation to generation through women who, though they bore no grand titles, carried the truth in their veins. Mazarin decisively broke the wax seal. Inside he found a tightly rolled strip of old parchment, no wider than a ribbon. On it was inscribed a complex cipher based on the principles of sacred geometry, intertwining circles and mirrored lines that, to the uninitiated eye, might seem no more than childish scribbles. But to Mazarin, trained from the age of 12 in the sacred arts of Templar cryptography, this cipher sounded like a beautiful psalm. It was not merely a location written in ordinary names, but a complex system of relationships. The divine golden ratio was encoded in the distances between ancient chapels, sanctuaries, and menhirs scattered throughout southern Gaul. It was a map that could only be seen from above, like a soaring hawk seeing its prey, or an angel recording its revelations. He remained seated in deep silence, his breathing shallow and fragmented, as the full implications rooted themselves in his consciousness like hammered iron nails. The ancient bloodline, despite all attempts to destroy it, had not vanished. It had merely been scattered, skillfully hidden in plain sight among silent tombs, by warm hearths in the homes of common people, in the hearts of daughters who bore forgotten names. And now, after long centuries of waiting, it seemed to be calling for its gathering. He looked at the rose again. At that moment, one of its dark red petals detached and gently fell to the ground, its edges curling like old parchment brought too close to a searing flame. It was an undeniable sign. Time, it seemed, was inexorably drawing near. At that very moment, far to the south, in a secluded abbey nestled among ancient olive groves and silent green hills, a young maiden named Isaura paused before her reflection in a mirror. The 17-year-old girl possessed hair the color of ancient oak and eyes as deep as dark wine or ink, holding some ancient mystery. Her hands, testaments to tireless labor, were calloused. She daily ground healing herbs, carried heavy buckets of water, and diligently cared for the suffering. And yet, as she pressed these worn hands to her heart, Isaura felt something unknown awakening beneath her skin, as if a mighty ancient current began its journey through her veins. Soon after, from behind her, the abbess silently entered the room. "You dreamed again," the old woman said, her voice more an assertion than a question. Isaura silently nodded in response. "Of the lion and the raging flame," he spoke, the girl clarified. The abbess's gaze immediately narrowed, reflecting a deep understanding. "You are ready," she whispered, and her voice held an ineffable solemnity. With slow, measured movements, as if performing a sacred ritual, the abbess opened a hidden drawer, whose existence was unknown to anyone else in the abbey. From its depths, she extracted an ancient pendant, a round disc, in the center of which an 8-pointed star was skillfully carved from ivory, dulled and darkened by countless centuries. "It is time for you to grasp the true essence of your origin," she concluded, handing over the artifact. Mazarin and Isaura would not meet for another 6 long months. During this period, 3 ancient crypts would be opened, the secrets of 2 powerful bloodlines brought to light, and 1 sacred secret would dangerously approach the threshold of revelation. But for now, the monastic garden remained in deep silence, as if holding its breath. The mystical rose, having fulfilled its mission of delivering the message, would once again close its tender petals, concealing an unsolved mystery within them, awaiting the arrival of a new generation or the emergence of another threat. And far beneath the flourishing garden, beneath centuries-old layers of intertwined roots and forgotten moss-covered stone, lay a hidden chamber, securely sealed with lime and strong iron. In its depths rested 3 artifacts of extraordinary significance. A stone chalice, of which legends whispered it was carved by Joseph of Arimathea himself. A book whose pages were bound in human skin, its mysterious words appearing only in reflection. And a sword, devoid of a blade, on which only one name was inscribed: Veritas. They had waited for centuries, but it was foretold that soon blood would once again make its claim. The candle, enclosed in the ancient lantern, had long since burned out, its wick struggling in vain against the heavy, stale, crypt-like air that filled the underground space. Mathurin's breath barely misted in the cold silence as he knelt before the ancient, weathered altar, his fingers firmly and resolutely gripping the hilt of the sacred sword, Veritas. The stone beneath him exuded cold and dampness, its surface faintly marked with faint, almost erased inscriptions, worn smooth by centuries of countless prayers and profound silence. It was here, beneath the unyielding foundation of the monastery, that the last sacred truth was kept, which he had carefully carried across Europe, not in the form of fragile scrolls or abstract symbols, but as a living legacy, imprinted in blood. Behind Mathurin, like a frozen statue, stood Isaura, clutching the ivory pendant to her heart. Her gaze, long accustomed to the subdued amber glow, now freely encompassed the entire vast space of the chamber. This was not merely a tomb, as she had initially supposed, but rather a memory etched in stone, a living history. Ancient frescoes seemed to dance across the walls, their once vibrant colors faded and dulled by the relentless passage of time. Among the images stood out figures of knights in crimson robes, riding towards the rising sun, the image of a crowned infant, raised aloft by an elder, enveloped in mystical starlight, and a sacred chalice, resting comfortably among the intertwined roots of an ancient olive tree. Mathurin's voice was hoarse, as if from the depths of ages, when he finally broke the solemn silence. These amazing images were created by the hand of Brother Almeric the Silent, he began. He was the last of the Templar artists who was granted the rare permission to depict on the walls what actually happened, not what official doctrine prescribed. This, he gestured broadly towards the fresco depicting the chalice and the infant, is not merely an ancient legend. It is irrefutable evidence of true events. Isaura cautiously approached, stepping with utmost care so as not to disturb the thin, patterned layer of ancient dust that covered the chamber floor. Her gaze, full of reverence, lingered on the image of the infant. Golden curls framed a serene face that exuded both innocence and a certain divine purity. "This child," she whispered, her voice barely trembling, "is this?" "Yes," Mathurin firmly replied, understanding her unfinished question. "This is the bloodline, a direct descendant, born of the union of Christ and Magdalene, carefully guarded for countless centuries by those called heretics, and mercilessly persecuted by those who feared that this great truth could shatter the established world order." Isaura felt the pendant pressed against her chest, as if it had gained additional weight, becoming heavier and more significant. Her fingers trembled slightly as she traced the polished, 8-pointed facets of the artifact. "And you truly believe that I belong to this ancient lineage?" she whispered, her voice tinged with doubt and hope. Maturin looked intently at her, his expression profound and not easily deciphered. "I no longer believe. I know," he said firmly, and there was no hesitation in his words. He slowly rose to his feet, and the sacred sword, Veritas, quietly creaked as it touched its scabbard. Then Maturin walked to an ancient stone cabinet, skillfully built into the wall. On its surface, carved into the stone, the sign of the lion and the cross was clearly visible. With noticeable effort, he pressed the hilt of Veritas into the central niche, and the sword smoothly slid into the stone, emitting a deep, resonant click. The ancient mechanisms inside the cabinet groaned, and the massive doors slowly swung open with a creak. Inside, on a velvet lining, rested an ancient codex, its pages sealed with red wax in 7 places. Beside it lay a small velvet pouch and a silver mirror the size of a palm, its edges inscribed with mysterious Latin inscriptions. 7 seals, Maturin whispered, his voice almost reverent. Each symbolizes an ancient covenant, treacherously violated by the Church over the centuries, and only the pure blood of the true lineage can break them, without resorting to destructive fire. Isaura involuntarily reached forward, but then hesitated. "But I've never even studied Latin," she said, expressing her concerns. "You won't need to," he replied softly but confidently. "Your hands, your flesh will remember what your mind may have forgotten. Blood holds knowledge that consciousness sometimes loses." With the utmost caution, Isaura lifted the ancient codex. The very moment her fingers barely touched its old cover, a powerful impulse surged through her entire body. It was not a painful sensation, but rather a wave of warmth, like that which envelops a person standing beneath a stained glass window, bathed in midday sunbeams. She gasped involuntarily, and before either of them could utter a word, one of the 7 red seals cracked and broke with a dry, distinct click. Maturin once again knelt, this time not in awe, but rather with a deep, all-consuming sense of relief. "So it is the purest truth," he whispered, barely suppressing his emotions. "You carry it within you." Isaura's voice trembled with shock and anticipation. "What will happen if I dare to open the others?" He looked at the silver mirror, which now glowed softly in the flickering light, as if coming alive. "You will remember, but not as distant stories or legends, but as lived truths. These will be visions transmitted to you through the very blood of your lineage." She hesitated for only a brief moment before making her decision. Then, slowly but with unwavering resolve, her hands trembling with tension, Isaura pressed her thumb to the next seal. One by one, with dry, distinct clicks, the seals broke, yielding to her touch. With each rupture, it seemed as if the chamber itself came alive and began to breathe. Its ancient walls exhaled the scent of age-old frankincense, and the floor palpably hummed with energy belonging to an entirely different century. Isaura's eyes involuntarily closed, and a kaleidoscope of images flooded her mind. She saw a boundless desert, strewn with myriad stars, a man weeping with tenderness, kissing the forehead of a newborn beneath a sprawling fig tree, Roman soldiers mercilessly burning ancient scrolls, while a veiled woman secretly carried one out, carefully wrapped in swaddling clothes, a fortress impregnably rising on a hill, knights with crimson crosses on white mantles, whispering oaths in a language long lost in the depths of time, a monastery surrounded by siege. sisters forming a living circle around an infant, radiating an inner, unearthly light. Isaura stumbled, her knees buckling, and Matarin managed to catch her. "Breathe," he said softly, soothingly. "All of this cannot return at once, in a single flood." Tears, hot and abundant, streamed down her cheeks. "It's real. All of it. I saw her. I saw her." "You saw Magdalene," Matarin said with deep reverence, "the one who carried light and hope to the world when it turned away from the truth." For a long time they remained in absolute silence, their figures frozen in stillness. The crypt, like a burial shroud, enveloped them in deep quiet, yet its former piercing coldness had now completely vanished. The hilt of the Veritas sword emitted a gentle, barely perceptible glow, as if an inner fire had awakened in its core. Meanwhile, the pendant resting on Isaura's neck distinctly pulsed, its rhythms steady and incredibly defined, as if counting important moments. Finally, Isaura decided to fully open the ancient codex. At her light touch, the parchment pages seemed to come alive, unfolding like a rare flower. The golden ink with which the writings were inscribed eagerly caught the meager lantern light, casting shimmering reflections. Complex diagrams of bloodlines, profound sacred instructions, and prophecies, expressed not in direct words, but in intricate symbolism, were revealed. "I am the bridge," she whispered, her gaze sweeping over the shining lines, her voice sounding distant. "I am the bearer of deep wounds and healing balm." Matarin, listening intently, slowly bowed his head. "This prophecy," he said, "means that your life will henceforth cease to belong solely to you. Many people will seek you, some to offer their protection and support, but many more will strive to silence you forever." Isaura looked up, and in her eyes now shone something different. They were clearer, wiser, as if in a single moment she had gained centuries of experience. "In that case, I will not hide. I will remember everything." He allowed himself a faint smile, devoid of ordinary joy, but carrying a shade of grim yet unwavering hope. "Then," he concluded, "I have fulfilled my ancient vow." From the folds of his cloak, he drew forth the last carefully preserved item, a letter, sealed with sealing wax. On the wax, the relief of a lion and a faint hazy outline of the sun were again clearly visible. "This message," he said, handing it to Isaura, "must be delivered to the one who awaits in Roussillon. He, like us, remembers the past." Isaura nodded, then asked, "And what about you?" "I remain here," he replied. "The bloodline must move on, forward. My place is in times gone by." She had already opened her mouth to object, but the discerning look in his eyes immediately silenced her. He had completely reconciled himself to his fate. This crypt, this sacred repository of truth, was destined to be for him both a final resting place and a temple. The last of the candles flickered faintly, its flame almost dying. Isaura resolutely stepped toward the passage, clutching the codex tightly in her hand, feeling the warmth of the pendant on her chest. The rose, symbol of the ancient lineage, had bloomed, and the world, without a doubt, would never be the same. The road leading to Montségur wound along the rocky ridge of the Pyrenees, resembling a serpent jealously guarding its priceless treasure. The winds howled relentlessly among the sheer cliffs and deep gorges, their mournful moan echoing the suffering of the dead, who once perished in the fiery embrace at the foot of the ancient fortress. Centuries later, the mountains still bore the imprint of scorched memory, and the blackened soil stubbornly refused to forget past tragedies. Claire's boots carefully slid on the damp, mossy stones as she ascended the last steps leading to the ruined walls of the citadel. Her cloak, soaked with thick fog, clung tightly to her shoulders, and her breath came in gasps from the exertion. Behind her, Brother Mathieu grunted heavily, struggling with a massive bronze chest. It was a narrow, time-worn casket, intricately adorned with an engraved Templar cross and flanked on either side by two majestic lions. "No man has set foot here since the great cleansing," he muttered, his voice full of foreboding. "This place is undoubtedly cursed." Claire stopped, turning sharply to him. "And yet we are here," she replied, her tone unwavering. "And we are heading straight into the heart of this curse." Mathieu grimaced, expressing his displeasure. "Because you, Claire, believe in an ancient prophecy." "I don't just believe," Claire said firmly and with icy calm. "I am convinced that Montségur holds the very truth they feared so desperately that they chose to burn 100 innocent souls alive rather than let it out. They passed beneath a fragmented arch that once served as the mighty gates of the fortress. Now, ivy and wild roses, like living embraces, entwined the ancient walls where warriors once kept their tireless vigil. In the vast courtyard, the bones of the former people had long since turned to dust and dissolved into legends. Yet Claire could almost physically feel the taste of charred, incinerated faith in the air. She involuntarily touched the hilt of her dagger, as if trying to reassure herself that some truths still remained tangible and unshakable. Inside the ruined chapel, Mathieu carefully placed the bronze box on the cracked altar. "This is it," he said, his voice trembling with excitement. "You saw its description in the ancient manuscripts." Claire merely nodded in confirmation. "The Book of Occitania," she clarified, "tells of an archive skillfully hidden beneath the floor of this chapel. It's not just scrolls or ordinary ink, but something more. It's blood. It's living memory. The true codex of the Sangreal." Mathieu's hands trembled noticeably as he opened the casket. Inside lay a small knife, a delicate ivory vial sealed with wax, and a yellowed parchment on which a detailed map of the chapel floor was inscribed. A red cross clearly marked the base of the altar. Claire knelt and began to methodically clear debris from the very base of the sanctuary. The stones yielded, sliding aside and revealing a hidden trapdoor whose iron ring was covered with a thick layer of rust, but remained intact. She easily opened it with her knife. A gust of stale, piercingly cold air immediately rushed out from the darkness below. Without the slightest hesitation, she lit a torch and confidently descended. The passage leading deep into the mountain was incredibly narrow, barely hewn into the solid rock, and twisted like a burrow dug by some prehistoric beast. The deeper Claire plunged into its depths, the more piercingly cold the air became. The cold was deadly, like frozen, ice-bound memory. Finally, the winding path opened into a small chamber, barely larger than a monk's cell. The walls of this hidden room were skillfully adorned with concentric circles of Templar iconography. Crosses, shining stars, the sacred monogram of Christ, and the symbol of a dove were engraved here. In the very center of the chamber stood a pedestal, carved from dark, night-black stone. On its summit rested the chalice. The chalice was not golden or studded with precious jewels, as romantic legends often depict. It was surprisingly simple, made of clay, covered with a glaze that, in its color and texture, resembled dried blood around the rim. Beside it rested another, smaller casket, sealed with bright red wax, on which was embossed the mysterious sign of an 8-pointed star. Claire reached for it, but suddenly stopped, as if an invisible force held her back. "It must be opened by blood," she whispered barely audibly, as if ancient knowledge had descended upon her. Mathieu, who now stood behind her, took a hesitant step forward. "This is pure madness," he said, his voice full of alarm. "Then madness is what brought us here," Claire replied coolly. She resolutely uncorked the ivory vial she had earlier taken from the bronze case and poured just one drop onto the crimson seal. The wax hissed, as if alive, and the casket slowly opened. Inside, to their surprise, was not a manuscript, but a massive stone tablet, on which an ancient, enigmatic code was engraved, Proto-Latin, skillfully mixed with Hebrew and mysterious Cathar symbols. Beneath the tablet lay a neatly folded linen cloth, yellowed and fragile from centuries of oblivion. Claire carefully unfolded the ancient fabric. Before their eyes appeared a genealogical tree, drawn in wine-red ink, but this was no ordinary tree. The names inscribed on it glowed faintly in the flickering torchlight. Jesus of Nazareth, Mary Magdalene, Sarah. The tree branched through the very fabric of time, and each of its nodes was marked not with familiar dates, but with enigmatic sacred symbols. Mathieu, stunned by what he saw, slumped to his knees. This is real," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Claire gasped, her throat tightening with emotion. "Sangreal," she said, "the living bloodline." She took a step back and surveyed the entire chamber. "This room," she concluded, her voice deep and solemn, "is not a tomb. It is a sacred sanctuary dedicated to eternal memory." Quiet mechanisms and ancient mysteries, a journey into the depths of history. Within the ancient walls, a faint mechanical whisper echoed. Tiny mechanisms clicked into place, and gears, like ancient guardians, subtly creaked, the air around them filled with a different, almost palpable premonition. Behind the pedestal, a second door silently swung open, revealing a long corridor. Its walls were lined with stone shelves, each holding sealed vessels. Some were made of rough clay, others of darkened, almost black glass, but all were marked with identical red ink. Among the inscriptions were Hebrew and Latin names, each holding its own story. Suddenly, Claire's gaze fell on one of the vessels, marked with her own surname, de Coeur. She involuntarily gasped, struck by the discovery. "I thought this was all about history, about the past," she whispered. "It is," Mathieu said quietly, his voice full of deep meaning. "But the past never dies. It merely waits for its time." Mathieu stepped forward and carefully opened the nearest vessel. Inside, amidst centuries of dust, lay a single bloody feather and a fragile yet astonishingly intact scroll. He began to read aloud in Latin, and the ancient words filled the space. Meanwhile, Claire ventured deeper into the archive, her steps echoing in the silence. At the very end of the corridor, rough stone gave way to a single striking mosaic, a lion devouring the sun. Surrounding it was a circle of 8 stars, identical to the pendant Claire wore around her neck. Her hand involuntarily went to her chest, and at that moment, the pendant began to emit a faint glow. The chamber, as if responding to this call, reacted. One of the shelves silently slid aside, revealing a hidden compartment filled with warm, golden light. Inside rested a reliquary, unlike any she had seen before. Crafted from stone, iron, and glass, it was shaped like a flame and pulsed faintly, like a living heart. Living, Mathieu whispered, crossing himself. This is not just blood, Claire whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. This is memory, life itself, contained within this vessel. They stood in reverent silence, the air around them humming with an ancient truth that seemed to permeate every particle of space. Outside, above majestic Montségur, storm clouds began to gather again, as if the mountain itself remembered and reacted to what had been found within its depths. Claire turned her gaze from the reliquary to Mathieu. This is not the end of our journey, she said, her voice full of determination. No, he agreed, nodding. This is the beginning of theirs. He pointed to the numerous vessels, to the names written in ancient ink, to the sleeping blood of centuries that awaited its awakening. Claire closed her eyes, inhaling deeply the mingled scent of stone, centuries of dust, and inevitable destiny. Let the world forget, but we will remember, she whispered. The air in the secret archive was cold and still, thick with the immense weight of memory. The walls, adorned with ancient Templar iconography, seemed to breathe with a life of their own, and every chisel mark was a silent whisper from the deep past. In the farthest corner of the chamber, beneath a hanging oil lamp whose wick flickered with an amber light dancing across the room's treasures, stood a battered oak lectern. Around it were alabaster and bronze vessels, scrolls carefully wrapped in goatskin, and wax-sealed boxes of unknown age. Claire stood beside her brother Mathieu, still holding the flame-shaped reliquary they had just discovered. Its warm glow had slightly dimmed, giving way to a quiet, rhythmic pulse, resembling a heartbeat. This is no ordinary reliquary, Mathieu murmured, his voice full of reverence. Its very design mimics the divine flame, the sacred spark of life. Claire carefully placed the precious vessel on the lectern. As it settled, a faint but distinct click echoed through the archive. A stone slab in the wall silently slid aside, revealing a smaller, hidden compartment. Inside, wrapped in velvet and sealed with a star-shaped wax seal, lay a scroll unlike any they had seen before. Mathieu reached for it, his hand pausing in hesitation. This seal, the 8-pointed star. This is the sigil of the original Council of Guardians. This is their testament, he said with deep awe. Claire solemnly nodded. Open it, she said, her voice firm. The monk carefully broke the seal, his fingers moving with respectful precision. As the scroll unfurled, a fine, almost invisible dust of centuries rose in the lamplight. The parchment was ancient, but the ink, still deep brown, retained its astonishing legibility. At the very beginning of the scroll, written in Latin, were the words Testamentum sanguinis, custodes, senti, testament of blood, guardians, feel. Mathieu began to translate aloud, his voice filling the secret archive. To those who bear the mark and the burden know this. The bloodline is sacred not for power, but for preservation. The vessel of divine heritage must never be used for rule, but to remind in the shadow of kings and the corruption of Rome. We have hidden the truth beneath stone and silence. Claire's heart beat faster. They knew, she whispered. They knew how the church and monarchs would distort it, appropriate it. Further down the scroll were listed names, descendants of this ancient bloodline, spanning centuries. Each name was accompanied by a special sigil, an indication of place, and a guardian's mark. Near the end, Claire found a name that sent a chill down her spine. Clarissa de Bouchard, guardian of the flame, daughter of the vine, the last heir of Magdalene's lineage. Clarissa, her full name, hidden from official records, even from herself. Claire's knees buckled, and she grasped the lectern for support. Mathieu rushed to support her, his face pale with realization. "They knew your bloodline centuries ago," he said with reverence. "Your existence was never accidental, it was foretold." She stared at her name, sealed in parchment long before her own birth. "My father," she murmured. "He must have known. Why else hide all this?" Mathieu continued to read. "Upon the ascent of the lion, when the flame and the vine meet beneath the moon's tower, the keeper of the last blood shall awaken the sealed sanctuary. Where rests the grail, which is not a cup, but a covenant?" Claire's mind reeled with the influx of information. "The grail is not a cup," she repeated, trying to grasp the meaning of these words. Mathieu shook his head. It was never meant for that. The word grail from Gridalis meant a step, a transition, a process, not a vessel for drinking, but a path to transformation, to a new understanding. They looked again at the flame-shaped reliquary. What they had initially taken for a simple container might actually be a key. The covenant mentioned in the scroll was not a physical object that could be possessed. It was a rite, a moment of transcendence and deep memory that was yet to be understood. From the farthest corner of the room, a faint tremor rippled, stirring ancient dust. Then one of the walls began to shimmer mysteriously, and on its surface, the clear outline of an arched doorway appeared, as if engraved by pure light, like a living entity responding to the unseen call of the ancient scroll. Mathieu gasped involuntarily, his voice breaking. "Claire, this scroll is the last seal that held the secret." She resolutely stepped forward. The moment her foot touched the floor, the flame-shaped reliquary pulsed in unison with her heartbeat. And then the ancient sigils carved on the doorway flared with new intensity. The star, the cross, the chalice, the elegant vine, and the mighty lion. "This is the sanctuary," Mathieu breathed, his voice barely audible with reverence. "The very place the Templars gave their lives to protect." Claire looked down at the last crucial lines of the scroll. To awaken the memory of light, the guardian must freely give what was given, blood unstained, intention undistorted. At this moment, she grasped the true meaning. The vessel demanded not merely her genetic connection, not ancestral blue blood. It craved her unconditional consent, her voluntary and conscious connection to the ancient bloodline, but not for power over the world, rather for the great remembrance. She turned to Mathieu, her gaze seeking answers. "You said all this isn't about power, so what is it about?" He smiled wearily but warmly, ancient wisdom shining in his eyes. "About hope. About legacy. About that eternal reminder that the divine can be deeply human, and the human sublimely divine." Claire took a step towards the archway. As she approached the ancient opening, the symbols flared brighter, and the stone itself began to move, not receding, but rising, gliding smoothly like a giant grate. A sudden gust of warm, dry air rushed into the archive, bringing with it a complex aroma, myrrh, old, decayed parchment, and something sweet and tart, like grapes crushed by hand. The sanctuary that opened beyond the arch was bathed in a golden glow, not artificial, but astonishingly natural. as if preserved by some unknown ancient alchemy. Inside, across the vaulted ceiling, frescoes came alive as if in a dance. There was Magdalene, gently embracing a child beside a man who was not crucified, but shone with an inner, inextinguishable light. Further on, a circle of guardians, clad in white and crimson mantles. And finally, an olive tree with blood-red roots and fruits burning with fire. Claire froze on the threshold, her breath caught. She felt something ancient awaken within her. This was not new knowledge, but rather a forgotten memory. She had been here before, or more precisely, her blood had. Behind her, Mathieu stood silently, overcome with deep reverence. With trembling fingers, Claire lifted the reliquary and stepped into the sanctuary. A low, vibrating hum resonated throughout the chamber. It was neither a voice nor merely a mechanical vibration, but something in between, defying clear definition. And at that very moment, as her foot crossed the sacred threshold, the frescoes came alive. Not literally, but with movements skillfully suggested by the play of light and shadow. The divine and human intertwining danced on the ceiling, and Claire suddenly understood that the Grail had never truly been lost. It lived, hidden in the hearts of those who were willing to remember. And now she would remember everything. The wind sang over the high ridge of Montségur, carrying the scents of wild sage and ancient stone. Claire stood on the edge of the fortress ruins, her boots seemingly rooted in the blood-soaked soil of centuries. The sun was just beginning its slow descent behind the jagged peaks of the Pyrenees, painting the sky in amber and fiery hues and bathing the ancient stones in golden light. In her hand, she clutched the final fragment, a goatskin scroll sealed with red wax, bearing the imprint of an 8-pointed star and the sigil of the Templar order. Mathieu approached her silently. He said nothing, only gently placed a hand on her shoulder, expressing with this gesture all that could not be conveyed in words. No more explanations were needed between them. They had passed through countless crypts, dark catacombs, sealed tombs, and long-forgotten monasteries. They had bled, hidden from persecutors, fled, deciphered ancient riddles, and doubted every step. But now, finally, they stood on the threshold of true revelation. Claire knelt beside the ruined stone altar that had once formed the heart of the Cathar citadel. Its surface was worn by time and covered with cracks. However, in the rays of the setting sun, faint, barely discernible carvings seemed to come alive. Runic spirals, elegant vines, and a central emblem, a chalice nestled within a lily. This was not merely a symbol of French royalty, but something far more ancient, profound, a sigil of a divine bloodline, carefully kept secret. She took out the scroll and broke the seal. The wax cracked with an unusually resonant sound, like the crunch of old bones. Inside, the parchment was fragile, but miraculously preserved. This time the text was written not in Latin, but in Occitan, smooth and fluid, with mysterious glyphs that occasionally interrupted the narrative, like constellations embedded in ancient scripture. "This is not a confession," Claire murmured, translating the words aloud. "This is a remembering, a memory recorded to protect the truth, the birthright." She looked up. Through the ruins, hidden behind a pile of collapsed stones and wild fennel, was the entrance to an ancient cistern. Claire had seen it before, in her dreams, a dark, round opening descending deep into the earth, guarded by a symbol carved on its threshold, a red cross flanked by 2 serpents. They descended together. The air below was cool, damp, and utterly silent. Underground, the world plunged into dense shadow. Only their torches illuminated the walls, covered with rough ochre frescoes depicting figures resembling Magdalene, carrying infants, crossing seas, standing beneath stars. These were images of women, veiled not by shame, but clothed in dignity, grace, and fierce intellect. Further, in the depths, they found it, a stone sarcophagus, unmarked by anything but an 8-pointed star, skillfully engraved on its lid. It rested on a pedestal, surrounded by small altars, each bearing a time-worn object, a bronze mirror, a white lily carved from bone, a stone chalice darkened by centuries, and a wooden box, carefully sealed with lead. Claire stepped forward, each beat of her heart echoing in her ears like the toll of a church bell. She did not need to ask permission. She placed her hand on the lid, and it felt warm. She spoke not a prayer, but a powerful declaration, equally filled with faith and fury. I am not here to worship the past. I am here to remember the truth. And then she lifted the lid. The interior revealed neither a lifeless body nor decayed bones. Only carefully folded linen fabric shone with virginal white, like the first snow. On its surface rested a single crimson ribbon, its edges showing signs of long existence, being worn and fragile. It served as a powerful symbol of blood, not vanquished by the passage of time, but carefully carried through the ages, patiently flowing through the veins of countless women and men. These people may never have suspected their ancient heritage, yet they embodied it in every manifestation of compassion, unwavering resilience, and inner light. Mathieu, barely holding his breath in awe, knelt beside the makeshift altar. "This is not the end," he said, his voice barely trembling. "No," Claire whispered, her words filled with deep meaning. "This is a rebirth." At that very moment, the ribbon trembled almost imperceptibly, as if from an invisible touch or a fleeting sigh. The torch flame, until then steady, began to flicker, casting whimsical shadows. Suddenly, something stirred. Behind a low rise, a section of the stone wall began to emit a faint glow. Beneath centuries of dust and mineral deposits, an ancient fresco was hidden. When the flickering torchlight finally touched its surface, the image slowly but surely revealed itself in its full splendor. It depicted a woman gently holding an infant, surrounded by a circle of stars. On the child's palm was a distinct mark, a chalice. However, beneath them stood not stern warriors, as one might expect, but women in long cloaks, their faces expressing serenity and inner strength. At their feet lay a red cross, split in two, yet miraculously remaining united. Claire's knees treacherously buckled, and she sank heavily onto the cold stone, feeling tears sting her eyes. "They never guarded a material relic," she said, her voice now more confident, filled with new understanding. "They guarded memory, the very truth they feared to lose, fearing it would be erased from history. That is why they hid it in symbols, in narratives, in unbroken bloodlines." Mathieu gently helped her up. "So what now?" he asked, awaiting an answer. "We must share this," she replied, looking firmly ahead, "but not with the whole world at once. The time is not yet right. We will share this knowledge only with those who have already begun to remember, with those who never truly forgot the taste of light." Together, they ascended from the depths back to the fading daylight. Above, the The sky was already painted in deep violet hues. A hawk circled majestically overhead, tracing wide spirals, and as the last farewell rays of the sun touched the ancient ruins of Montségur, Claire saw something amazing. She saw it not with ordinary eyes, but with something far more ancient, lying beyond ordinary perception, the clear outline of the original fortress, recreated in a radiant golden light. This was either a vision, or perhaps the awakened memory of the stone itself, and beyond it lay a road, unmarked on any known map, yet ancient, patiently awaiting its hour. She turned to Mathieu, and in her gaze was a question. "Are you ready to follow it?" He merely smiled in response. "I have followed it all my life," he said with deep conviction. As the first stars began to twinkle in the boundless heavens, they walked forward, hand in hand, along this invisible path. This was not the end of their journey, but rather the beginning of something far deeper. It was a path to a place where blood and light merge, to a place where truth resides not in dusty archives, but in the depths of human hearts, to a place where the past finally remembers itself,